I never thought the person I trusted most could rewrite reality. Then, one evening, I caught her staring at me with that familiar soft smile. And suddenly, I questioned everything I remembered. Last week's late-night apology? Didn't happen. My high school best friend's support? A scripted performance. She'd told me she'd texted directions, but my phone log said otherwise. Every memory trembled. That's when I realized I was living someone else's story. Here's the twist. I'm not alone. According to experts, 5 insidious tactics, from relentless guilt trips to sudden affection withdrawals, lock you into someone else's narrative until you can't tell where you end and they begin. I should have seen the signs. Gaslighting whispers subtler than venom praise, and the suffocating silence that speaks louder than any fight. But I was too deep. Now, I'm piecing together a shattered self, hunting for the truth behind every whispered promise. And as I uncover each hidden trap, I realize survival means walking through fire and refusing to let her write my ending. So if you think you've heard it all, you haven't. Hit follow on your favorite platform and leave us a comment, because the next story might just change the way you see everything. Don't miss a single twisted turn. Chapter 1. The First Whisper of Doubt. I used to think survival meant climbing mountains or braving storms. I never imagined it would begin with a smile. My name is Tessa, and for as long as I could remember, I trusted my best friend more than anyone, maybe more than myself. Lila and I met in art class when we were 16. Paint-splattered jeans, cider-sweet laughter, shared secrets whispered under fluorescent lights. We were inseparable. She was my compass and I hers. But somewhere along the way, my compass started pointing toward places I'd never been. It started with small things. A Tuesday evening in March, ordinary and boring. I'd woken up that morning with a line from a movie stuck in my head. Something about second chances and forgiveness. It was from this indie film I'd watched over the weekend. This raw, beautiful story about a woman reconnecting with her estranged sister. The dialogue had hit me hard, and I couldn't shake it. That afternoon, walking our usual stretch of cracked sidewalk between the coffee shop and the park, I mentioned it to Lila. You know that movie we watched Sunday night? The one with the sisters? God, that line about forgiveness just keeps echoing in my head. Lila stopped mid-step, collecting pebbles in her palm like little treasures. I didn't see it, she said, her voice calm, matter-of-fact. I blinked. What do you mean you didn't see it? We watched it together. At your place. You made that weird popcorn with nutritional yeast. She looked at me with that familiar soft smile, the one that usually made me feel seen and understood. But this time, something about it felt different. Foreign. Tessa, I think you're confused. We didn't watch any movie Sunday night. I was at my mom's house, remember? The family dinner. The ground seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I could still taste that weird popcorn. I could still picture us curled up on her sectional sofa, the glow of her laptop screen painting our faces blue. I remembered her crying during the scene where the older sister finally apologized. I remembered her reaching for my hand when it got emotional. But I started, then stopped. The certainty in her voice made me doubt my own memory. Had I dreamed it? Had I watched it alone and somehow convinced myself she was there? I forced a laugh and tucked the doubt away, like a stone in my pocket. Oh, right. Yeah, the family dinner. Sorry, I must be mixing things up. But as we kept walking, the stone grew heavier. That same evening, I realized my phone hadn't received her text about dinner plans, though she insisted she'd sent it. We'd made plans to try that new Thai place downtown, the one with the murals of elephants painted on the walls. I'd been looking forward to it all week. But when 7 o'clock rolled around and I hadn't heard from her, I called. Where are you? I asked when she picked up. I thought we were meeting at 7. I texted you hours ago, she said, and I could hear the slight annoyance in her voice. I said I had to cancel. Family stuff came up. My mind scrambled through my phone, searching through messages. Nothing. No text. No missed call notification. I don't see any texts, Lila. My phone's been with me all day. That's weird, she said, but her tone suggested it wasn't weird at all. It suggested I was weird for not receiving a text that clearly existed. Maybe it didn't go through? Technology, you know? But I knew my phone. I knew I checked it obsessively. I knew there had been no text. The next morning, there was still nothing. My phone log showed no evidence of any communication from her that day. When I mentioned it again, gently, carefully, she shrugged. You must have deleted it by accident. You do that sometimes when you're stressed. Do I? I thought. When have I ever done that? But instead of pushing back, I apologized. I apologized for being confused. I apologized for not remembering things correctly. I apologized for making her repeat herself. And that's when I realized something was shifting in the landscape of our friendship. Something I couldn't quite name yet, but could feel in my bones. Gaslighting. I'd read about it once in a psychology article. It was a word for twisting reality until you questioned your sanity, making someone doubt their own perceptions and memories until they couldn't trust themselves anymore. It was named after an old movie where a husband dims the gas lights in their house and then denies it when his wife notices, making her think she's going crazy. I thought, you don't know me, gaslighting. This was just stress. Maybe I was confused. Maybe my memory was playing tricks on me. It happens to everyone, right? But then I saw her smile curl like a question mark on her lips, watched her paint a different history of our friendship with soft words and practiced ease. Each lie seemed small enough to ignore, until the edges of my world began to blur. The thing about gaslighting is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with fanfare or obvious cruelty. It slips in through the cracks of trust, disguised as concern, wrapped in the voice of someone you love. The manipulator becomes an expert at reading your weaknesses, your need for validation, your fear of conflict. They learn exactly which buttons to press to make you question everything you thought you knew about yourself. Dr. Stephanie Sarkis, who has written extensively about gaslighting, explains that the technique is particularly effective because it's implemented gradually. It starts with small contradictions, little moments where reality seems slightly off-kilter. The victim begins to doubt their own perception, their own memory. They start apologizing for things they didn't do wrong. They start believing they're too sensitive or overreacting. And that's exactly what was happening to me. Over the next few weeks, more incidents piled up like autumn leaves. Lila would make plans, and then claim we'd never discuss them. She'd tell me stories about her life, and then, days later, insist the details were different. She'd promise to call me back, and then act confused when I mentioned she hadn't. Each time, I found myself apologizing. Each time, I found myself doubting my own experience. The worst part wasn't the confusion, it was the isolation. Because how do you explain to someone else that your best friend is rewriting history? How do you say, she's making me doubt my own memory, without sounding paranoid or unstable? Friends with experience of gaslighting describe this exact phenomenon. Rachel, a 27-year-old woman who was gaslit by a close friend while working abroad, describes the experience. I was catatonically depressed, like not getting out of bed, suicidal. It was terrible, and it took a lot of time to bring myself out of that situation. She explains how her friend would tell her that people were talking about her behind her back, how she'd spread lies and then deny saying them when confronted by others. The psychological impact is profound because gaslighting doesn't just attack your perception of events, it attacks your sense of self. When someone consistently contradicts your reality, you begin to lose faith in your own judgment. You start to question not just what happened, but who you are. I started keeping notes. Not because I didn't trust Lila, I told myself, but because I was obviously having memory problems. I needed to keep track of things better. I wrote down conversations, plans we made, things she said. I even started taking screenshots of text messages, though I felt ridiculous doing it. But the notes revealed a pattern of promises broken, stories changed, realities rewritten. The evidence was there in black and white, but somehow, when faced with her confident denials, I still found myself apologizing. That's the insidious power of gaslighting. It makes you complicit in your own confusion. You become so afraid of seeming unreasonable, so desperate to preserve the relationship, that you'll sacrifice your own sense of reality rather than risk conflict. I started having trouble sleeping. I'd lie awake at 3 a.m, replaying conversations, trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong. Had I really been that forgetful? That prone to confusion? Maybe I was stressed. Maybe I needed to see a doctor. Maybe something was wrong with me. But somewhere deep down, in a part of myself I was learning not to trust, a small voice whispered, "What if there's nothing wrong with you? What if she's doing this on purpose?" I pushed that voice away. This was Lila we were talking about. Lila, who'd held my hair back when I had food poisoning sophomore year. Lila, who'd driven me to the emergency room when I'd cut my hand making dinner. Lila, who knew all my secrets and had never betrayed a single one. Except, Had she? Now I couldn't be sure. Now I couldn't be sure of anything. The research on gaslighting shows that victims often experience what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the mental stress that occurs when your beliefs and experiences don't match up. Your brain knows something is wrong, but it struggles to reconcile the caring person you thought you knew with the reality of what's happening to you. This is particularly devastating when it happens in close relationships. A romantic partner or best friend has intimate access to your insecurities, your history, your triggers. They know exactly how to exploit your need for their approval. They know which emotional buttons will make you doubt yourself most effectively. Love bombing often precedes gaslighting in manipulative relationships. The manipulator showers their target with affection, attention, and validation, creating an intense emotional bond. Then they begin to withdraw that affection unpredictably, using the victim's desperation to regain the initial high to control their behavior. Looking back, I could see this pattern in my friendship with Lila. The early days had been intoxicating. Hours of deep conversation, constant texting, a sense that I'd finally found someone who truly understood me. She'd made me feel special, chosen, seen in a way I'd never experienced before. But gradually, that intense attention had become conditional. It was tied to my willingness to accept her version of events, to not push back when she contradicted me, to apologize when I should have stood my ground. I was learning that manipulation isn't always loud and obvious. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it comes disguised as love. Dr. George Simon, who specializes in manipulative personalities, notes that the most skilled manipulators are often charming and likable. They understand their victim's psychology intimately. They know that blatant abuse would be recognized and rejected, so they operate with subtlety. They gaslight with a smile. The evening that really opened my eyes happened about 6 weeks after the movie incident. Lila and I were having coffee at our usual spot, a tiny cafe with mismatched chairs and walls covered in local artwork. I'd been feeling anxious all week, doubting myself more than usual, and I decided to talk to her about it. "I've been feeling really scattered lately," I said, stirring sugar into my latte. "Like I can't keep track of things. Maybe I should see someone about it." Her face immediately shifted to an expression of concern. "Oh, honey, what's been going on?" I told her about my memory problems, my confusion about conversations and plans. I didn't mention that most of these problems seemed to center around her. I didn't want to sound accusatory. She listened with the kind of focused attention that had originally drawn me to her. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. "Tessa," she said softly, "I think you might be having more stress than you realize. You've seemed different lately. More fragile, I guess. Like you're not quite present." The word fragile hit me like a slap. I'd never thought of myself as fragile. I'd always been the strong one, the reliable one, the friend people came to for advice. "What do you mean?" I asked. "It's just, you've been so sensitive about everything. Getting upset over little misunderstandings. Making plans we never actually made. I've been worried about you." There it was again, that reality revision. But this time, she wasn't just changing the facts. She was changing my identity. I wasn't someone experiencing confusion because of her mixed signals. I was someone who was fragile, sensitive, prone to making plans we never actually made. "I don't feel fragile," I said quietly. She squeezed my hand. "I know, sweetie. That's part of what worries me. Maybe you should talk to someone, a therapist or something, just to help you work through whatever's going on." And there it was, the perfect gaslighting maneuver. She'd taken my own concern about my mental state and reflected it back to me as evidence that something was wrong with me, not with our dynamic. She'd positioned herself as the caring friend who was trying to help, while simultaneously suggesting that my perception of reality couldn't be trusted. I walked home that night feeling hollow. The stone of doubt in my pocket had grown into a boulder, and I was struggling to carry its weight. But something had shifted during that conversation. For the first time, I'd noticed the technique in real time. I'd felt the moment when she took my words and twisted them, the moment when she positioned herself as my reality's narrator instead of its co-creator. It was a tiny crack in the wall she'd built around my perceptions, a crack that would eventually let in light. That night, I climbed into bed and stared at the ceiling, heart thrumming with something like fear. If she could make me doubt a silly movie quote, if she could make me question my own memory, if she could convince me I was fragile when I'd never felt that way before, What else could she rewrite? In that moment, I understood that survival wasn't about storms outside, but the ones swirling inside my mind. And for the first time since this all began, I wondered, what if the storm wasn't a natural disaster? What if someone was controlling the weather? The research confirms what I was beginning to understand. Gaslighting is a deliberate technique, not an accident. It's a strategy intended to break down your trust in your memory, your instincts, and your self-esteem. It's designed to make you dependent on the manipulator's version of reality, because you can no longer trust your own. The victims of gaslighting describe a common experience: the gradual erosion of self-trust. You start apologizing for things you didn't do. You start asking others to confirm your memories. You start believing you're too sensitive or overreacting, when you're actually responding normally to abnormal treatment. Amanda Phillips, a gaslighting survivor, describes it this way. Gaslighting is a fog of sorts. It disarms and casts a smoke and mirrors effect. You can explain how to navigate it in theory, but when you have 1,000 people shouting instructions at you who have never been on that particular path, you start to believe in the illusion even more. That fog was thick around me now, but I was beginning to see that it wasn't natural weather. It was manufactured. And somewhere in the distance, barely visible through the haze, I could make out the outline of someone controlling the machine. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I started paying attention not just to what Lila said, but to how she said it. Not just to the content of our interactions, but to the patterns underneath. I started watching for the smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the way she tilted her head when she was about to contradict something I'd said, the careful modulation in her voice when she was rewriting history. I started learning to recognize the difference between confusion and manipulation. And most importantly, I started trusting that small voice inside me that whispered, "What if there's nothing wrong with you?" It would take me months to fully understand what was happening. It would take even longer to find my way out. But that night, staring at the ceiling with fear thrumming in my chest, was the first time I considered the possibility that I wasn't losing my mind. I was having it stolen from me. And it all started with one quiet whisper of doubt about a movie I knew we'd watched together. A movie that, according to my best friend, had never existed at all. The gaslighting experts say that recovery begins with a single moment of clarity. One instant when you recognize that your reality is being manipulated. For me, that moment came not with dramatic revelation, but with a simple question that I finally allowed myself to ask. What if I'm not crazy? What if she is? But the question alone wasn't enough. I still had to live with the consequences of asking it. I still had to figure out how to trust myself again. I still had to learn to recognize the other weapons in her arsenal. Because gaslighting, I was about to discover, was just the beginning. Chapter 2. When Love Feels Like Drowning. 2 months before I realized I was being manipulated, Lila saved my life. Or at least, that's how she made it seem. It was a Thursday afternoon in early April, and I was having what I now know was a panic attack. But at the time, I thought I was dying. My chest felt tight, my hands were shaking, and no matter how deeply I breathed, I couldn't seem to get enough air. I was sitting in my car outside the grocery store, paralyzed by the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. That's when Lila appeared at my window like an angel. "Oh my God, Tessa, what's wrong?" she said, pulling open my car door and sliding into the passenger seat. I hadn't even noticed her in the parking lot, but suddenly she was there, her hands on my shoulders, her voice calm and soothing. "I can't breathe," I gasped. "Yes, you can," she said firmly. "Look at me. Breathe with me. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. She guided me through breathing exercises until my heart rate slowed and the world came back into focus. When it was over, she wrapped me in the kind of hug that made me feel like I was the most important person in the universe. "You're okay," she whispered. "I've got you. I'll always have you." Looking back, I can see how perfectly orchestrated that moment was. How she appeared at exactly the right time, said exactly the right things, provided exactly the comfort I needed. But in that moment, all I felt was overwhelming gratitude. Lila had witnessed me at my most vulnerable and hadn't run away. She'd stayed. She'd helped. She'd promised to always be there. That night, she took me back to her apartment and made me chamomile tea. She wrapped me in her softest blanket and put on my favorite movie, the one we'd supposedly never watched together. She ordered Thai food from the place we'd supposedly never planned to visit. And when I mentioned these inconsistencies, she just smiled and said, "I want to do everything I can to make you feel better." The love bombing had begun. Love bombing, according to relationship experts, is a manipulation tactic where someone overwhelms their target with excessive attention, affection, and gifts to gain control over them. Unlike genuine affection, love bombing is calculated. It's designed to create intense emotional dependency by making the target feel special, chosen, and deeply understood. Dr. Elena Tiani, a psychologist who specializes in toxic relationships, explains. Initially, you might feel safe, secure, and swept off your feet because grand gestures are a self-esteem boost and make you feel important and desired. But the love bomber's ultimate goal is not just to seek love, but to gain control over someone else. The research shows that love bombing is particularly effective because it exploits fundamental human needs for connection and validation. When someone showers us with attention and affection, our brains release dopamine and oxytocin, the same chemicals involved in addiction. We become literally addicted to their approval. But here's what I didn't understand then. Love bombing isn't just about the intensity of attention. It's about the timing. Love bombers strike when their targets are vulnerable, offering themselves as the solution to whatever pain or insecurity exists. In the weeks following my panic attack, Lila became my constant companion. She texted me good morning every single day. She brought me coffee during my lunch breaks. She remembered every small detail I mentioned. My favorite song, my childhood fears, the way I liked my eggs cooked. She made me feel seen in a way I'd never experienced before. "You're so different from everyone else," she'd tell me. "I've never met anyone who understands me the way you do." She'd say things like, "I feel like we were meant to find each other, and you're exactly what I've been missing my whole life." At the time, these declarations felt romantic and profound. Now I recognize them as classic love-bombing phrases, designed to make the target feel uniquely special and irreplaceable. The attention was intoxicating. Lila would call me at random times just to say she was thinking about me. She'd show up at my workplace with my favorite sandwich. She'd text me pictures of things that reminded her of me. Sunsets, quotes from books, funny memes. I felt like I was the center of her universe. But love bombing isn't just about positive attention. It's also about creating emotional dependency through strategic vulnerability. Lila began sharing intimate details about her past, her difficult relationship with her mother, her struggles with anxiety, her fear of abandonment. She made me feel like I was the only person who could truly understand and help her. "I've never felt safe enough to tell anyone this before," she'd say, tears in her eyes. "But I trust you completely." This sharing created what psychologists call trauma bonding, an intense emotional connection formed through shared vulnerability and the illusion of mutual rescue. I felt honored to be her confidant, responsible for her emotional well-being, and terrified of doing anything that might cause her to withdraw that trust. The gifts started small. A book she thought I'd like, a candle that smelled like my favorite flower, a bracelet that reminded her of me. But gradually, they became more extravagant. She bought me an expensive necklace, just because. She surprised me with tickets to a concert I'd mentioned wanting to attend. She paid for dinners at restaurants I could never afford myself. "I love spoiling you," she'd say when I protested. "You deserve to be treated like a queen." Dr. George Simon, who studies manipulative personalities, notes that excessive generosity early in a relationship is often a red flag. The gifts aren't really gifts, they're investments. They create a sense of obligation and indebtedness that the manipulator can later cash in on. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of Lila's love bombing was how she positioned herself as my emotional rescue. Whenever I felt stressed, anxious, or overwhelmed, she was there with solutions. Bad day at work. She'd surprise me with my favorite ice cream. Fighting with my family? She'd invite me over for a home-cooked meal and hours of supportive conversation. Feeling insecure about my appearance? She'd spend an hour telling me how beautiful I was. She became my emotional regulation system. Instead of learning to cope with difficult feelings on my own, I learned to rely on her presence, her reassurance, her validation. Without realizing it, I was becoming emotionally dependent. Emotional dependency, according to research published in the Journal of Personality Psychology, involves intense fears of abandonment, excessive need for reassurance, and the subordination of one's own needs to maintain the relationship. People with emotional dependency often modify their own plans, seek constant emotional expression from their partner, and engage in attention-seeking behaviors to maintain the connection. This is exactly what started happening to me. I found myself canceling plans with other friends to spend time with Lila. I stopped pursuing hobbies she wasn't interested in. I even changed my style to match preferences she'd casually mentioned. I told myself I was just being a good friend, but really, I was terrified of losing her approval. The love bombing phase typically lasts between a few weeks to several months. During this time, the target becomes increasingly isolated from other support systems and increasingly dependent on the love bomber for emotional stability. The target's self-worth becomes tied to the manipulator's approval, setting the stage for future control. Dr. Susan Trotter, a relationship coach, explains, people tend to present their best self initially, so if any of these behaviors or traits manifest early on, it is important to pay attention. It is likely that these issues won't change and, in fact, will likely worsen and become toxic over time. But I wasn't paying attention to red flags. I was drowning in what felt like the deepest, most meaningful connection I'd ever experienced. Lila and I spent almost every day together. We had inside jokes, shared memories, synchronized schedules. She knew my coffee order by heart. I knew her favorite constellation. We finished each other's sentences and communicated with looks across crowded rooms. To outside observers, we probably looked like the perfect friendship. But there were subtle signs that something wasn't quite right, signs I dismissed because they were overshadowed by all the positive attention. She needed to know where I was all the time, not in an obvious, controlling way, but through casual questions woven into conversation. What are you up to tonight? Who are you having lunch with? How was your meeting with Sarah? At first, I interpreted this as caring interest. Now I understand it was information gathering. She had opinions about my other friendships. Never direct criticism, but subtle comments that planted seeds of doubt. Sarah seems kind of negative lately, doesn't she? I hope Marcus isn't taking advantage of your generosity. You're so much more relaxed when it's just us. Gradually, I found myself questioning these other relationships and spending less time nurturing them. She remembered everything I told her, but selectively. She could recall intimate details about my childhood trauma, but somehow forgot conversations where I'd expressed different preferences or opinions. She remembered my vulnerabilities perfectly, but had trouble remembering times when I'd disagreed with her or expressed independent thoughts. She needed constant reassurance about our friendship. We're best friends, right? You'd tell me if something was bothering you, wouldn't you? I couldn't handle it if anything happened to our friendship. These statements, delivered with vulnerable eyes and a shaky voice, made me feel responsible for her emotional stability. She created what researchers call relationship exclusivity, without explicitly asking for it. She'd make comments about how other people didn't really understand her, how most friendships were shallow, how rare it was to find someone you could truly trust. The implication was clear. What we had was special, and I shouldn't risk diluting it by investing too heavily in other relationships. Looking back, I can see how systematically she was isolating me. But at the time, it felt like falling in love. With friendship, with connection, with the version of myself she reflected back to me. The version of myself she showed me was intoxicating. Through her eyes, I was funny, intelligent, deeply empathetic, and uniquely gifted. She laughed at all my jokes. She sought my advice on important decisions. She told me I had a way of seeing the world that made everything clearer for her. You have this incredible ability to make people feel understood, she'd tell me. It's like you can see straight into someone's soul. This reflected identity became addictive. When I was with Lila, I felt like the best version of myself. When I was away from her, I felt diminished, less vibrant, less valuable. I started structuring my life around maintaining that reflected image. I began monitoring my own behavior and thoughts through what I imagined was her perspective. Would Lila approve of this choice? Would this story amuse her? Would this outfit impress her? My internal compass gradually reoriented itself around her approval. The psychological term for this is external locus of control. When someone's sense of self-worth becomes dependent on external validation rather than internal self-knowledge. People with emotional dependency often struggle with this, looking to others to define their value and identity. Research shows that love bombing is particularly effective on people who have low self-esteem, a history of trauma, or strong empathetic tendencies. These individuals are more likely to interpret excessive attention as genuine love and more willing to sacrifice their own needs to maintain the connection. I checked every box. But the most dangerous aspect of love bombing isn't the intensity of positive attention. It's the underlying message that this attention is conditional and fragile. Love bombers subtly communicate that their affection could be withdrawn at any moment, that the target must continue earning and maintaining this special treatment. Lila never said this explicitly, but the message was embedded in everything she did. The way she'd go quiet when I mentioned other friends. The way her enthusiasm would dim when I talked about activities she wasn't involved in. The way she'd get a hurt look in her eyes when I couldn't immediately respond to her texts. I learned to read these subtle signals and adjust my behavior accordingly. I became hyper-vigilant about maintaining her approval, constantly scanning for signs that I might be disappointing her or losing her interest. This hypervigilance is exhausting, but it's also addictive. When you're constantly working to earn someone's approval, the moments when you succeed feel like victories. The relief of seeing her smile, the rush of making her laugh, the warmth of her affection. These became the highs that kept me coming back for more. Dr. Stephanie Sarkis, who has written extensively about manipulation tactics, explains that this cycle of tension and relief is similar to what happens in abusive relationships. The target becomes addicted to the relief phase, interpreting it as evidence of deep love rather than recognizing it as part of a manipulative cycle. 3 months into our intensified friendship, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd made a decision without considering Lila's potential reaction. I couldn't remember the last time I'd spent a full day without texting her. I couldn't remember what my life had felt like before she became the center of it. But I told myself this was what deep friendship looked like. This was what it meant to have someone who truly understood you. This was what I'd been missing all my life. I had no idea that love bombing is just the first phase of a manipulation cycle. I had no idea that all this intensity and attention was designed to make me dependent, to break down my resistance to future control, to ensure that when the manipulation escalated, I'd be too emotionally invested to walk away. I had no idea that the person who made me feel most loved was systematically destroying my ability to love myself. The research on love bombing shows that it's often followed by a gradual shift in the manipulator's behavior. The excessive attention begins to feel normal, expected. The manipulator starts introducing subtle criticism, small disappointments, minor violations of trust. The target, now addicted to the high of approval and terrified of losing the connection, becomes willing to tolerate increasingly problematic behavior. This is exactly what happened next. But first, there was that magical period where I felt like I was living in a fairy tale, where every day brought new evidence of how special our connection was, where I felt chosen, understood, and deeply loved. It's hard to explain how intoxicating it felt to be the center of someone's attention like that, to feel like every text you send will be eagerly received, every story you tell will be carefully listened to, every mood you express will be sensitively responded to. It was like having a personal cheerleader, therapist, and best friend all rolled into one person who seemed to exist solely to make me feel valued. I started taking screenshots of her sweetest messages. I saved voicemails where she told me how much our friendship meant to her. I kept ticket stubs from events we attended together, pressed flowers she gave me, little notes she left in my car. I was building a shrine to what felt like the most meaningful relationship of my life. But I was also losing myself. The friends I'd had before Lila began to feel less important, less understanding, less capable of meeting my emotional needs. My hobbies and interests began to feel hollow if they didn't involve her. My own thoughts and feelings began to feel less valid if they didn't align with hers. I was becoming a satellite orbiting around her sun, forgetting that I'd once had my own light. The psychological research on emotional dependency identifies this exact pattern. When someone becomes the primary source of validation and emotional regulation in your life, you begin to lose touch with your own internal guidance system. You stop trusting your own judgments and start relying on their reactions to determine how you should feel about yourself and your experiences. This is particularly dangerous because it sets you up to accept increasingly problematic behavior. When someone has become your primary source of self-worth, you'll rationalize almost anything to maintain that connection. You'll ignore red flags, excuse bad behavior, and sacrifice your own well-being to keep the relationship intact. But in those early months, I couldn't see any of this. All I could see was how loved I felt, how understood, how special. All I could feel was gratitude for having found someone who seemed to see and appreciate every part of me. I had no idea that love bombing is designed to be temporary, that all that excessive attention and affection was an investment in future control, that I was being systematically prepared for manipulation. I had no idea that the person who was making me feel most loved was actually teaching me to abandon myself. The love bombing phase ended gradually, so gradually that I almost didn't notice at first. The good morning texts became less frequent. The surprise visits to my workplace stopped. The elaborate gifts were replaced with smaller tokens. The intense emotional conversations became shorter, more surface level. When I mentioned these changes, Lila had perfectly reasonable explanations. She was busy with work. She was dealing with family stress. She was going through a rough patch and needed some space to sort things out. She reassured me that our friendship was still special, still important, but she just needed to pull back a little. And because I was now emotionally dependent on her approval, I accepted these explanations without question. I told myself I was being understanding, supportive, mature. I told myself that real friendship meant giving someone space when they needed it. But inside, I was panicking. The withdrawal of her attention felt like withdrawal from a drug. I found myself checking my phone obsessively, analyzing the tone of her messages, searching for signs that everything was still okay between us. I started working harder to earn back her full attention. I became more accommodating, more helpful, more understanding. I ignored my own needs and focused entirely on what I could do to support her through whatever she was going through. I had no idea that this was exactly the response she was hoping for, that the withdrawal of love-bombing attention wasn't about her needing space. It was about training me to chase her approval, to work harder for her attention, to prioritize her needs over my own. I had no idea that I was being prepared for the next phase of manipulation. But in those final weeks of love bombing, when everything still felt magical and special, I thought I'd found my soulmate. Not in a romantic sense, but in the deepest possible sense of human connection. I thought I'd found the person who would be my constant companion, my emotional safe harbor, my closest confidant for the rest of my life. I thought I'd found love. I had no idea I'd found my captor. The irony of love bombing is that it feels exactly like what we're all searching for: to be seen, understood, valued, and cherished. It feels like the deepest possible connection, the most meaningful relationship, the answer to loneliness and insecurity. But it's actually the opposite. It's a systematic dismantling of your ability to see, understand, value, and cherish yourself. It's the creation of dependency disguised as love. It's captivity disguised as connection. And by the time you realize what's happening, you're already in too deep to easily find your way out. That realization was still months away for me. For now, I was still basking in the afterglow of feeling so deeply loved, still treasuring every moment of connection, still grateful to have found someone who seemed to understand me so completely. I still believed I was the luckiest person in the world. I had no idea that luck had nothing to do with it, that everything I was experiencing had been carefully calculated, strategically implemented, and systematically designed to ensure my future compliance. I had no idea that when someone seems too good to be true, it's because they usually are. But I was about to learn. Chapter 3. The Rescue That Wasn't. 6 months into our friendship, Lila rescued me again. Or at least, that's what I thought at the time. It was a Friday evening in October, and I was having the worst week of my life. My boss had criticized my work in front of the entire team. My landlord had raised my rent by $300, and my car had broken down on the way to my grandmother's funeral. I felt like the universe was conspiring against me, and I was drowning in a sea of problems I couldn't solve. That's when my phone rang. "Tessa." Lila's voice was soft, concerned. "I can hear it in your voice. What's wrong?" I hadn't even said hello yet. But she was right. I probably did sound terrible. I was terrible. I told her everything. The work humiliation, the financial stress, the grief, the exhaustion. By the time I finished, I was crying so hard I could barely breathe. "Oh, honey," she said, and I could hear the genuine compassion in her voice. "I'm coming over right now. Don't you dare try to deal with this alone." Within 30 minutes, she was at my door with a bag of groceries, a bottle of wine, and the kind of determined maternal energy that made me feel like someone finally cared enough to save me from myself. She cooked dinner while I sat on my couch in my pajamas, still sniffling. She poured wine and listened to me replay every awful detail of the week. She rubbed my shoulders and told me that my boss was an idiot, that everything would work out, that I was stronger than I knew. "You don't deserve any of this," she said firmly. "You're one of the most genuine, caring people I know, and the world doesn't deserve you." That night, she held me while I cried myself to sleep on the couch. When I woke up the next morning, she'd made coffee and pancakes and was sitting in my kitchen like she belonged there. "How are we feeling today?" she asked, studying my face with the intensity of a concerned parent. "Better," I said, and it was true. Having her there made everything feel more manageable. "Good," she said, "because I have a plan." The manufactured crisis. What I didn't understand then was that crisis creation is one of the most insidious manipulation tactics in existence. The manipulator doesn't necessarily cause the crisis, though sometimes they do, but they position themselves as the essential solution to problems that may have resolved naturally or been manageable with normal support systems. Dr. George Simon, who has extensively studied manipulative personalities, explains that skilled manipulators often exploit moments of vulnerability to establish themselves as indispensable. They swoop in during genuine crises, but they also manufacture smaller emergencies to keep their targets dependent and off balance. Looking back, I can see how perfectly Lila had positioned herself. She hadn't caused my terrible week, but she'd been monitoring my stress levels, asking probing questions about my work situation, checking in on my finances. She knew I was vulnerable long before the crisis hit, and when it did hit, she was ready. The rescue fantasy is powerful because it feeds into our deepest psychological needs. We all want to feel like someone cares enough to save us, like we're worth fighting for, like we don't have to face life's challenges alone. When someone steps into that role, especially during genuine distress, it creates an intense emotional bond. But research shows that healthy support looks different from rescuing. Healthy support involves listening, validating emotions, offering practical help when asked, and encouraging the person to develop their own coping strategies. Rescuing, on the other hand, involves taking over, solving problems without being asked, and creating dependency on the rescuer's continued presence. Lila's plan was comprehensive. She was going to help me look for a new job. She was going to lend me money for the rent increase. She was going to drive me places until I could afford to fix my car. She was going to be my safety net, my solution, my salvation. At first, it felt like the most generous offer anyone had ever made me. Someone finally saw how much I was struggling and was willing to do something about it. I felt so grateful, so relieved, so lucky to have found someone who cared about me that much. But the savior complex, as psychologists call it, isn't really about the person being saved. It's about the savior's need to feel important, needed, and in control. People with savior complexes are drawn to vulnerability because it gives them a sense of purpose and power. They derive their self-worth from being indispensable to others. The research shows that savior relationships create unhealthy dependency patterns. The person being saved gradually loses confidence in their ability to handle problems independently. They become accustomed to having someone else take charge, make decisions, and provide solutions. Meanwhile, the savior becomes addicted to being needed and will often unconsciously sabotage their target's attempts at independence. I accepted Lila's help gratefully, but I also accepted the subtle message that came with it. I wasn't capable of handling my own life. The strings attached. What I didn't recognize immediately were the conditions that came with Lila's rescue. She helped me update my resume, but she had strong opinions about which jobs I should apply for. Nothing too demanding, she said, because I was still fragile from everything I'd been through. Nothing that would require me to travel, because what if I had another crisis and she couldn't reach me? Nothing with evening hours, because that was our time together. She lent me money for rent, but she wanted detailed accounting of how I spent the rest of my income. She needed to make sure I wasn't being financially irresponsible again. She suggested I cancel my streaming subscriptions, stop buying coffee out, and reconsider my spending on groceries. She drove me places, but she wanted to know where I was going, who I was seeing, and when I'd be back. She offered to pick me up from social events, but she'd arrive early and somehow end up joining the gathering. She'd make comments about how tired I looked, how I shouldn't overextend myself, how she was worried about me. These weren't the actions of someone trying to control me, I told myself. These were the actions of someone who cared deeply about my well-being. Someone who had invested so much in helping me that she naturally wanted to protect that investment. But research on manipulation tactics shows that creating dependency is often followed by increasing control. The manipulator positions themselves as essential to the target's well-being, then gradually expands their influence over the target's decisions, relationships, and daily life. The beautiful thing about the rescue scenario is that it makes the target complicit in their own manipulation. Because you accepted help, because you benefited from their generosity, because you allowed them to solve your problems, you feel obligated to accept their continued involvement in your life. You feel guilty questioning their motives or resisting their control. After all, where would you be without them? The grateful prisoner. Within a month of Lila's rescue, I found myself in a strange position. My immediate crises had been resolved, but I was more dependent on her than ever. She'd helped me get a new job, one that she'd recommended, at a company where she knew someone. It wasn't my dream job, but it was safe, stable, and paid enough to cover my expenses. The rent situation was handled. My car was fixed, courtesy of a loan from Lila that I was paying back in small installments. On paper, my life was better than it had been in months. But I felt hollow, confused, and somehow smaller than before. I hadn't chosen any of these solutions. I hadn't worked through the problem-solving process myself. I hadn't had the chance to discover my own resilience or develop new coping strategies. Instead, I'd been guided through a series of decisions by someone who seemed to know better than I did what was good for me. The psychological research on learned helplessness explains what was happening to me. When people are repeatedly rescued from difficult situations without being allowed to develop their own solutions, they begin to doubt their ability to handle challenges independently. They become passive, waiting for someone else to tell them what to do, how to think, and who to trust. This is exactly what Lila wanted. Not consciously, perhaps, but the effect was the same. I was becoming more manageable, more compliant, more dependent on her guidance and approval. She'd positioned herself as the expert on my life, and I'd accepted that positioning because she'd proven her expertise by solving my problems. But in doing so, I'd given up my agency, my autonomy, and my confidence in my own judgment. Dr. Maury Joseph, a psychologist who studies savior complexes, notes that people with these tendencies often have fantasies of omnipotence. They believe they have the power to single-handedly fix other people's lives. But this fantasy requires the other person to remain broken, dependent, and grateful. If I became too independent, too confident, too capable of handling my own problems, Lila would lose her sense of purpose in my life. So she had a vested interest in keeping me vulnerable, even if she wasn't consciously aware of it. The signs were subtle but consistent. Whenever I expressed confidence about something, she'd remind me of how I'd fallen apart just a few months earlier. Whenever I mentioned wanting to try something new or challenging, she'd worry aloud about whether I was ready. Whenever I showed signs of independence, she'd find a new crisis to help me navigate. The cycle continues. 2 weeks after I started my new job, I came home to find Lila sitting in my apartment. I'd given her a spare key during my crisis for emergencies, but this wasn't an emergency. She was just there, sitting on my couch like she owned it. "How was your day?" she asked, studying my face with that familiar intensity. "Fine," I said, setting down my purse. "Good, actually. I think I'm getting the hang of things." She frowned slightly. "You look tired. Are you sure you're not overexerting yourself? This job might be too much too soon." I wasn't tired. I felt energized, capable, proud of how quickly I was learning. But her concerned expression made me second-guess my own experience. "Maybe," I said uncertainly. "I did have to stay late to finish a project." "That's exactly what I was worried about," she said, standing up and moving toward me. "You need to set boundaries, Tessa. You can't let them take advantage of you like your last boss did." She was right, in a way. Setting boundaries was important. But I wasn't being taken advantage of. I was being given interesting work and proving myself capable of handling it. The late night had been my choice, my way of showing dedication and competence. But under her worried gaze, it transformed into evidence of my poor judgment and tendency to be exploited. "I brought dinner," she said, gesturing toward the kitchen. "And I think we need to talk about developing some strategies to protect you in this new environment." This became our pattern. I'd have a good day, feel proud of my progress, come home excited to share my small victories. And Lila would be there, ready to reframe my successes as signs of trouble, my growing confidence as evidence of naivety. She was creating what psychologists call manufactured vulnerability. Instead of allowing me to build on my strengths and successes, she was finding ways to make me doubt myself, question my judgment, and remain dependent on her guidance. The crisis creation was subtle but constant. She'd point out potential problems I hadn't noticed, remind me of past failures, suggest dangers I should be worried about. She was manufacturing reasons for me to need her continued involvement in my life. Dr. Stephanie Sarkis, who has written extensively about gaslighting and manipulation, explains that manipulators often use a technique called ingratiating deflection. They perform acts of kindness to seem more credible and caring, but there's always an ulterior motive. The kindness is designed to make it harder for the target to recognize or resist the manipulation. This was exactly what was happening. Every time I felt uncomfortable with Lila's increasing control over my life, I'd remember how she'd saved me during my worst week. Every time I wanted to assert my independence, I'd think about all she'd done for me, all she'd sacrificed to help me. How could I be ungrateful? How could I question the motives of someone who'd proven her devotion so completely? The price of rescue. 3 months after Lila's dramatic rescue, I realized I hadn't made a significant decision without consulting her since that terrible October week. Where to live? She thought my apartment was perfect for now. What to eat? She worried about my tendency toward emotional eating. How to spend my weekends? Quiet activities were best while I was still recovering. Who to spend time with? Most of my other friends didn't really understand what I'd been through. I told myself this was temporary. I was still rebuilding after my crisis, still learning to trust my judgment again. Having someone I could rely on for guidance was healthy, mature, responsible. But the research on codependency and savior complexes tells a different story. When someone consistently positions themselves as the solution to your problems, you begin to lose touch with your own problem-solving abilities. When someone constantly offers guidance and direction, you start to doubt your own internal compass. The most insidious part of the rescue dynamic is that it feels like love. It feels like someone cares about you so much that they're willing to sacrifice their own time, energy, and resources to ensure your well-being. It feels like security, support, devotion. But real love encourages independence, not dependence. Real support helps you develop your own capabilities, not rely on someone else's. Real care wants you to grow stronger, not remain vulnerable. Lila's rescue had felt like the most generous gift anyone had ever given me. But I was beginning to understand that gifts with strings attached aren't really gifts at all. They're investments. And the return on investment she was expecting was my continued compliance, gratitude, and dependence. The psychological term for this is trauma bonding, the intense emotional connection that forms when someone rescues you during a crisis. It creates a powerful sense of loyalty and obligation that's difficult to break, even when the relationship becomes unhealthy. But trauma bonding isn't the same as genuine love or friendship. It's a byproduct of manipulation, designed to keep you emotionally invested in someone who may not have your best interests at heart. I was learning this the hard way. The inciting incident. The moment that changed everything happened on a cold Thursday evening in November. I'd been working late again. Not because I had to, but because I was enjoying a particularly challenging project. I felt competent, engaged, proud of the creative solutions I was developing. When I got home, Lila was waiting for me. Again. "We need to talk," she said, her face serious. I sat down across from her, immediately shifting into crisis mode. Had I done something wrong? Was she upset with me? Had something terrible happened? "I'm worried about you," she began, and I felt the familiar knot of anxiety form in my stomach. "You're working too much, isolating yourself, falling back into the same patterns that got you into trouble before." I stared at her, confused. I wasn't isolating myself. I was building relationships with new coworkers. I wasn't working too much. I was excelling at a job I was finally starting to enjoy. I wasn't falling into old patterns. I was developing new, healthier ones. "I don't understand," I said. "Of course you don't," she said, her voice taking on that patient, maternal tone that had once made me feel cared for. "That's the problem. You're not seeing clearly. You're getting caught up in the same cycle of overcommitment and burnout that landed you in crisis before." But I hadn't been in a cycle of overcommitment and burnout before. I'd had a genuinely terrible week where multiple stressful events had converged. That wasn't the same thing as a pattern of self-destructive behavior. As I listened to her rewrite the history of my life, painting me as someone with chronic poor judgment who needed constant monitoring and guidance, something inside me began to rebel. "Lila," I said slowly, "I think I'm doing okay. Better than okay, actually. I'm happy with my job. I'm managing my finances. You're in denial," she interrupted. "Just like before. Just like when you thought you could handle everything on your own and ended up calling me in tears." The condescension in her voice was unmistakable. She was talking to me like I was a child, someone incapable of accurate self-assessment or responsible decision-making. And for the first time since she'd rescued me, I felt angry instead of grateful. "I called you because I was having a bad week," I said, my voice stronger now. "Not because I'm fundamentally incapable of managing my life." Her expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something cold passing across her features before settling back into concerned compassion. "Tessa," she said softly, "I love you. That's why I'm saying this. I can see things you can't see because I'm not caught up in your emotions. I've been watching you repeat the same mistakes, make the same poor choices, and I can't just sit by and watch you destroy yourself again. Again. Like my week of genuine crisis had been self-destruction rather than a normal human response to multiple stressors." That's when I realized what was happening. Lila hadn't rescued me from a crisis. She'd rescued me from my own supposed inadequacy. She'd positioned herself not just as a helpful friend, but as someone fundamentally more capable, more insightful, more trustworthy than I was. She'd made herself indispensable by convincing me I was dispensable to myself. The moment of clarity. "What mistakes?" I asked, genuinely curious now. "What poor choices am I making?" She launched into a detailed analysis of my recent behavior. I was working late too often, but I enjoyed the work and was receiving positive feedback. I was spending money on unnecessary things, like buying lunch occasionally instead of bringing it from home. I was being too friendly with coworkers, which could lead to boundary issues. I was not prioritizing our friendship enough. I hadn't been available for a spontaneous dinner the previous weekend because I had plans with someone else. As I listened to her catalog of my supposed failures, I realized that every single item on her list was actually evidence of my growing independence and confidence. I was succeeding at work. I was making new friends. I was managing my finances responsibly while also allowing myself small pleasures. I was maintaining boundaries around my time and energy. But in Lila's narrative, all of these positive developments were reframed as problems that required her intervention. This is what manipulators do, according to the research on psychological manipulation. They reframe their target's strengths as weaknesses, their successes as failures, their independence as dangerous self-delusion. They become the sole authority on what constitutes healthy behavior, good judgment, and appropriate choices. "Lila," I said carefully, "I think we might see this situation differently." Her face hardened almost imperceptibly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I think I'm doing well. I think I'm making good choices. I think I'm in a better place than I've been in a long time." The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, I saw something in her expression that I'd never seen before. Not concern, not love, not compassion, but something cold and calculating. Then the mask slipped back into place. "Oh, Tessa," she said, her voice dripping with pity. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. You're so desperate to believe you're okay that you can't see how much you're struggling. This false confidence, this denial, it's just another symptom of the deeper issues we've been working on. Like my recovery was a joint project. Like my life was something we were managing together. I'm not in denial," I said firmly. "I'm happy. I'm proud of how I'm handling things. I'm grateful for your help during that difficult time, but I think I'm ready to." "Ready to what?" she interrupted. "Make the same mistakes again? Push away the people who care about you? Convince yourself you don't need support or guidance? This is textbook self-sabotage, Tessa." But it wasn't self-sabotage. It was self-advocacy. It was the first time in months that I'd trusted my own perception over hers. And judging by her reaction, that was exactly what she'd been trying to prevent. The manipulation revealed. In that moment, I understood something that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. Lila hadn't saved me. She'd captured me. Her rescue had been real, but it hadn't been altruistic. It had been strategic. She'd used my moment of genuine vulnerability to establish herself as indispensable, then worked systematically to maintain that dependency. The crisis creation, the manufactured vulnerability, the constant monitoring and guidance, it was all designed to keep me in a state of learned helplessness. As long as I believed I couldn't handle my own life, I'd continue to need her to handle it for me. This is what psychologists call the savior complex, or white knight syndrome. It's not really about helping others. It's about the helper's need to feel powerful, important, and in control. The person being saved becomes a project, a source of validation, a way for the savior to prove their own worth. But real help empowers people to solve their own problems. Real support builds confidence and independence. Real love wants you to grow stronger, not remain weak. Lila's version of help had done the opposite. It had made me smaller, more dependent, less trusting of my own judgment. It had isolated me from other sources of support while positioning her as the only person who truly understood my needs. I think, I said slowly, my voice steadier than I felt, I need some space to figure out what I really want. Without guidance or input or advice. Just space. The transformation in her expression was startling. The mask of loving concern disappeared entirely, replaced by something cold and angry. After everything I've done for you, she said, her voice sharp. After all the time and energy and money I've invested in helping you get back on your feet, this is how you repay me? By pushing me away the moment you think you don't need me anymore. There it was, the truth behind the rescue. It hadn't been a gift. It had been an investment, and she expected a return on that investment in the form of my continued gratitude, dependence, and compliance. I'm not pushing you away, I said. I'm just asking for space to. You're being selfish, she snapped. You're being ungrateful. You're making the same self-destructive choices that got you into crisis in the first place. But fine, go ahead. Make your mistakes. When you come crawling back, and you will, don't expect me to pick up the pieces again. She stormed out, leaving me sitting alone in my apartment with the echo of her threats ringing in my ears. And for the first time in months, I felt free. The aftermath. The next few days were difficult. Not because I regretted asking for space, but because I was processing the magnitude of what had happened. The person I'd trusted most, the person I'd been most grateful to, the person who'd positioned herself as my salvation. She'd been systematically undermining my autonomy and self-confidence for months. The rescue that had felt like love had actually been a form of captivity. The guidance that had felt like wisdom had actually been a form of control. The generosity that had felt like friendship had actually been a form of manipulation. Research on manipulation tactics shows that victims often experience confusion and self-doubt when they first recognize what's been happening to them. The manipulator has spent so much time reframing reality that it becomes difficult to trust your own perceptions. Had I imagined the manipulation? Was I being ungrateful? Had Lila really been trying to help, and I was too damaged to receive it properly? But as I replayed our interactions over the past few months, the pattern became undeniable. Every time I'd shown signs of independence, she'd found a reason to be concerned. Every time I'd felt confident, she'd pointed out potential problems. Every time I'd wanted to make my own choices, she'd questioned my judgment. She hadn't been protecting me from my poor decision-making. She'd been protecting herself from my good decision-making. Because if I became truly independent, truly confident, truly capable of managing my own life, I wouldn't need her anymore. And for someone with a savior complex, being needed is everything. The recognition, the inciting incident had been subtle. Just a conversation where I'd finally pushed back against her narrative of my inadequacy. But it had revealed the true nature of our relationship dynamic. I hadn't been rescued. I'd been recruited. Not for friendship, but for a role in her psychological drama where she was the wise, generous savior and I was the grateful, dependent victim. The research on trauma bonding explains why this realization was so difficult and disorienting. When someone rescues you during a genuine crisis, it creates an intense emotional connection that feels like love, but is actually based on power imbalance and dependency. Breaking free from that dynamic requires recognizing that the person who made you feel most saved was actually the person who most wanted to keep you feeling like you needed saving. It was a painful recognition, but it was also liberating. For the first time in months, I was seeing clearly. And what I saw was that I was stronger, more capable, and more resilient than I'd been allowed to believe. The crisis that had brought Lila into my life hadn't been evidence of my fundamental inadequacy. It had been a normal human response to genuinely difficult circumstances. And I'd been in the process of recovering from it naturally when she'd swooped in to rescue me from my own supposed helplessness. But I wasn't helpless. I never had been. I was about to prove it. Chapter 4. The First Pivot. The confrontation I'd been avoiding finally happened on a gray December morning, 3 weeks after I'd asked Lila for space. She'd been texting me constantly. Not the usual flood of daily messages, but calculated volleys designed to pull me back into her orbit. Concerned check-ins about my mental health. Reminders of inside jokes we shared. Photos of things that reminded her of me. Each message felt like a small hook, trying to catch some part of me that still needed her approval. I'd been practicing what therapists call gray rock, responding minimally, giving her nothing to work with. One-word answers. Long delays between responses. Polite but distant acknowledgments that revealed nothing about my inner state. But that morning, she showed up at my apartment. I opened the door to find her standing in my hallway with coffee and pastries, wearing the kind of vulnerable expression that had once made me drop everything to comfort her. "I brought breakfast," she said, holding up the bag like an offering. I thought maybe we could talk. 3 months earlier, this gesture would have melted my resistance immediately. The thoughtfulness, the effort, the implicit message that she cared enough to show up. It would have overridden any boundaries I'd tried to set. But now, I could see the manipulation embedded in the kindness. She'd arrived unannounced, making it socially awkward for me to refuse her. She'd brought my favorite pastries, invoking our shared history and her intimate knowledge of my preferences. She'd positioned herself as the vulnerable one reaching out, making me the bad guy if I turned her away. "Lila," I said carefully, not stepping aside to let her in. "I told you I needed space." "I know," she said, her eyes already filling with tears. "But I've been so worried about you. You haven't been yourself lately, and I can't just stand by and watch you isolate yourself. That's not what friends do." There it was, the reframe that had worked so effectively before. My request for space became evidence of mental instability. My boundary became something she was obligated to violate out of concern for my well-being. My autonomy became a symptom she needed to treat. But this time I recognized the pattern, the art of boundary enforcement. Research on manipulation tactics shows that manipulators often escalate their behavior when their targets start to resist. Dr. Jennifer Degler, who specializes in emotional manipulation, notes that manipulators want you to go back to the way you were before when they could control you more easily. When you set boundaries with manipulative people, she explains, you should expect pain and pushback. The pushback can take many forms. They might invalidate your right to the boundary, demanding detailed explanations they can poke holes in. They might deny the behavior that prompted the boundary in the first place, gaslighting you about your own experiences. They might play the victim, making you feel guilty for protecting yourself. What I was experiencing with Lila was a classic example of boundary violation disguised as care. She was showing up uninvited and framing it as love. She was ignoring my explicitly stated need for space and calling it friendship. She was positioning my self-protection as selfishness. Dr. Stephanie Sarkis, who has written extensively about gaslighting, explains that manipulators often use what she calls ingratiating deflection. They perform acts of kindness to seem more credible and caring, but there's always an ulterior motive. The kindness is designed to make it harder for the target to recognize or resist the manipulation. Standing in my doorway, I could feel the familiar pull of Lila's vulnerability. Part of me wanted to let her in, to accept the coffee and pastries, to have the conversation she wanted. It would be easier than holding firm. It might even feel good in the moment. But I'd learned something crucial in the weeks since our last confrontation. The discomfort of enforcing boundaries is temporary, but the damage of allowing them to be violated is cumulative. "I understand you're worried," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But showing up at my apartment when I've asked for space isn't helping. It's actually making things harder for me." Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of annoyance before settling back into concerned compassion. "Tessa, I'm here because I love you," she said, taking a small step closer. "I can see you're struggling, and I can't just abandon you when you need support the most. That's not who I am." This was masterful manipulation disguised as devotion. She was making my boundary about her character. implying that respecting my request for space would make her a bad person, an abandoner, someone who lacked love and loyalty. She was forcing me to choose between maintaining my boundary and allowing her to maintain her self-image as a caring friend. But research shows that healthy support respects boundaries, even when those boundaries are uncomfortable. Someone who truly cares about your well-being will honor your requests for space, even if they don't understand or agree with them. They'll find ways to show support that don't violate your stated needs. The confrontation escalates. "If you love me," I said carefully, "then please respect what I'm asking for. I need space right now, and showing up like this feels like you're not hearing me." The mask slipped again, more noticeably this time. For a moment, I saw something cold and calculating in her expression. The look of someone whose strategy wasn't working and was rapidly calculating alternatives. "So this is how it's going to be," she said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "After everything I've done for you, after all the times I've been there when no one else was, you're just going to shut me out." Here was the guilt trip I'd been expecting, delivered with surgical precision. She was invoking her past generosity as evidence of her right to access me now. She was positioning my boundary as ingratitude, my self-protection as betrayal. This is what psychologists call trauma bonding. The intense emotional connection that forms when someone rescues you during a crisis, creating a sense of obligation that's difficult to break. Manipulators often use their past kindnesses as leverage to maintain control, making their targets feel guilty for asserting independence. But I'd spent weeks processing the true nature of Lila's help. I'd come to understand that her rescue had been strategic, designed to create dependency rather than genuine healing. I'd realized that her generosity had always come with strings attached. "I'm grateful for your help during that difficult time," I said, choosing my words carefully. "But gratitude doesn't mean I owe you unlimited access to my life. I still need space, and I need you to respect that." Her face hardened completely now, the vulnerable mask abandoned. "You're being manipulated," she said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone I'd once found so comforting. "Someone is filling your head with ideas about me, making you doubt our friendship. This isn't you talking, Tessa. This is someone else's influence." This was perhaps the most insidious manipulation tactic of all. The suggestion that my growing independence was actually evidence of external manipulation. By positioning my boundary setting as the result of outside influence, she was denying my agency, my ability to think for myself, my right to make autonomous decisions about my own relationships. Dr. George Simon, who studies manipulative personalities, notes that this is a common deflection tactic. When confronted with their behavior, manipulators often claim that the confrontation is really coming from someone else, that the target has been turned against them by a third party. This allows them to avoid taking responsibility for their actions while simultaneously undermining the target's confidence in their own perceptions. "No one is influencing me," I said firmly. "This is my decision, based on my own experience of our friendship. I've realized that some of the dynamics between us aren't healthy for me, and I need space to figure out what I want." "What dynamics?" she demanded, her voice rising. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" The moment of truth. This was the moment I'd been dreading, the direct confrontation about her behavior. Research on dealing with manipulators suggests that confronting them directly is often ineffective, as they're skilled at deflection, denial, and turning the conversation back on their target. Many experts recommend disengagement rather than confrontation. But I was trapped in my own doorway, and she was demanding answers. I could either retreat into vague generalities or name what had been happening between us. I chose honesty. "I've realized that you've been gaslighting me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "making me doubt my own memories and perceptions. You've been using my vulnerabilities against me, creating crises so you could rescue me. You've been isolating me from other friends and making me dependent on your approval." The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, I saw genuine shock in her expression. Not the shock of someone falsely accused, but the shock of someone whose hidden behavior had been accurately identified and named. Then the denials began. "That's absolutely not true," she said, her voice taking on a dangerous edge. "I have never gaslighted you. I have never manipulated you. Everything I've done has been out of love and concern for your well-being." This was exactly the response manipulation experts predict. When confronted directly, manipulators typically deny the behavior entirely, often with increased intensity and emotion. They may become angry, hurt, or indignant, using their emotional response as evidence of their innocence. The movie we watched together that you said never happened. I continued, my voice gaining strength. The texts you claimed to send that never appeared on my phone. The way you've consistently undermined my confidence and made me doubt my own judgment. You're having memory problems, she said, her voice taking on that familiar patient, maternal tone that had once made me feel cared for. You've been under a lot of stress, and it's affecting your ability to think clearly. This paranoid thinking, these accusations, this is exactly what I've been worried about. Here was the gaslighting in real time. My accurate identification of her manipulation tactics being reframed as evidence of my mental instability. She was attempting to use my own confrontation as proof that I needed her guidance and couldn't trust my own perceptions. But I'd prepared for this. I'd spent weeks documenting our interactions, taking screenshots of conversations, writing down her exact words. I'd built a paper trail that validated my experiences and protected me from her reality distortions. I have the evidence, Lila, I said quietly. I have records of our conversations. I have notes about the incidents you're denying. I know what happened, and I know what you've been doing. The change in her expression was startling. The concerned friend disappeared entirely, replaced by something cold and calculating. You've been spying on me? She said, her voice filled with indignation. Recording our private conversations? Taking screenshots of personal messages? That's a violation of trust, Tessa. That's not what friends do to each other. This was what manipulation experts call deflection. When confronted with evidence of their behavior, manipulators often focus on how the evidence was gathered rather than addressing the behavior itself. She was trying to make my documentation of her manipulation more problematic than the manipulation itself. I documented our interactions to protect my own sanity, I said, because you kept making me doubt what had actually happened between us. So instead of talking to me about your concerns, you decided to build a case against me behind my back, she said, her voice taking on a hurt, betrayed tone. This is paranoid behavior, Tessa. This is exactly the kind of thinking that worries me about your mental state. The final manipulation. What happened next was perhaps the most manipulative thing Lila had ever done to me. She began to cry, not the gentle tears of earlier, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from a place of profound pain. I don't understand how we got here, she said through her tears. I've loved you like a sister. I've been there for you through everything. And now you're treating me like I'm some kind of monster. The emotional manipulation was expertly deployed. She was positioning herself as the victim of my accusations, making me the aggressor in our dynamic. She was invoking the language of family, like a sister, to make rejecting her feel like betraying blood. She was using her tears to trigger my empathy and make me feel guilty for confronting her. Research shows that manipulators often use emotional displays strategically, not necessarily feeling the emotions they're expressing, but understanding their power to influence others. These displays are designed to shift the focus from their behavior to their pain, making their targets feel responsible for comforting them rather than maintaining boundaries. Part of me wanted to comfort her. The sight of her tears activated every caregiving instinct I'd developed over our friendship. But I'd learned to recognize the difference between genuine emotion and emotional manipulation. I don't think you're a monster, I said carefully. But I do think our friendship has become unhealthy for me, and I need space to figure out what I want. What if I promise to change? She said through her tears. What if I work on the things you've mentioned? Can't we try to fix this together? This was the final trap. The promise of change that would keep me engaged while nothing actually changed. Manipulators often make vague commitments to improvement when confronted, knowing that their targets want to believe change is possible. But research shows that real change requires acknowledgement of the problematic behavior, understanding of its impact, and a sustained commitment to different actions. Lila had just spent 20 minutes denying that any problematic behavior had occurred. She couldn't promise to change something she claimed didn't exist. I need space regardless, I said. This isn't about you changing. This is about me needing time to process and figure out what's healthy for me. Her tears stopped as suddenly as they'd begun. Fine, she said, her voice suddenly cold and clipped. If that's what you want. But don't come crawling back to me when you realize what you've thrown away. Don't expect me to pick up the pieces when this decision destroys your life. And there was the threat I'd been expecting. the implicit promise that rejecting her would lead to disaster. She was positioning herself as essential to my well-being and predicting catastrophe if I chose independence. She turned and walked away without another word, leaving me standing in my doorway with my heart pounding and my hands shaking. But also, for the first place in months, feeling free. The aftermath of confrontation. The hours following Lila's departure were intense. I felt a mixture of emotions: relief, guilt, fear, anger, sadness. Part of me wanted to call her back, to apologize, to return to the familiar dynamic where she guided my choices and I provided her with gratitude and compliance. But I'd crossed a threshold I couldn't uncross. I'd named her behavior accurately and stood firm in my boundary despite her escalating manipulation tactics. I'd refused to be guilt back into a relationship that was damaging my sense of self. Research on breaking free from manipulative relationships shows that the period immediately following confrontation is often the most difficult. The target may experience what feels like withdrawal from the intense emotional connection, doubt about their decision, and fear about navigating life without the manipulator's involvement. Dr. Jennifer Degler notes that this is exactly what manipulators count on, that their targets will be so uncomfortable with the pushback and guilt that they'll abandon their boundaries and return to the familiar dynamic. The manipulator's job is to make independence feel more frightening than dependence. But I'd prepared for this. I'd built a support network of people who weren't involved in my dynamic with Lila, my therapist, a few trusted friends, my sister. I'd educated myself about manipulation tactics and trauma bonding. I'd documented the problematic behaviors, so I couldn't be gaslit out of my own experience. Most importantly, I'd connected with my own internal guidance system, the part of me that had been systematically undermined during the love bombing and dependency phases of our relationship. That evening, I sat in my apartment and made a list of all the decisions I'd been afraid to make without Lila's input. Where to go for dinner, what movie to watch, how to spend my weekend, what to wear to work, whether to pursue a hobby she'd shown no interest in. The list was embarrassingly long. I'd given her authority over aspects of my life that should have been entirely my own choice. But I'd reclaimed that authority. And despite the discomfort of enforcing my boundary, despite the guilt of rejecting her tears and promises, despite the fear of navigating life without her constant involvement, I felt more like myself than I had in months. The psychology of confrontation. What I'd experienced with Lila was a textbook example of what happens when someone with manipulative tendencies is confronted directly about their behavior. The response typically follows a predictable pattern: denial, complete rejection of the accusations, often with increased emotional intensity. Deflection, shifting focus to the target's behavior: you're being paranoid, you're overreacting. Victimization, positioning themselves as the injured party. Emotional manipulation, using tears, anger, or vulnerability to trigger the target's empathy. Threats or punishment, warning of consequences if the confrontation continues. Lila had used every single one of these tactics in our doorway conversation. She denied gaslighting me while actively gaslighting me about my mental state. She deflected by focusing on my documentation rather than her behavior. She'd positioned herself as the victim of my paranoid accusations. She'd used tears to trigger my guilt. And she'd ended with a threat about what would happen if I maintained my boundary. This is why many experts recommend avoiding direct confrontation with manipulators whenever possible. The confrontation rarely leads to acknowledgement or change, and it often escalates the manipulative behavior. But sometimes confrontation is unavoidable, especially when the manipulator violates boundaries and demands explanations. In these cases, preparation is key. Having documentation, support systems, and a clear understanding of manipulation tactics can help you maintain your perspective when the manipulator deploys their arsenal of deflection techniques. Most importantly, you have to be prepared for the fact that they will not admit to the behavior you're describing. They will not apologize sincerely. They will not commit to meaningful change. The goal of confrontation is not to get them to acknowledge their manipulation. It's to clearly state your boundaries and demonstrate your commitment to enforcing them. The isolation campaign. Over the following weeks, I discovered that Lila's manipulation extended beyond our private interactions. She'd been talking to mutual friends, sharing her concerns about my paranoid behavior and mental health struggles. She'd been positioning herself as the worried friend dealing with someone who was having a breakdown. This is what experts call triangulation, involving third parties in a conflict to create allies and isolate the target. Manipulators often work to control the narrative around relationship conflicts, ensuring that their version of events reaches mutual friends before the target's version can. I found out about this campaign accidentally when a mutual acquaintance approached me at a coffee shop. "Hey, I heard you've been going through a rough time," she said with the kind of careful sympathy reserved for people who might be unstable. "Lila mentioned you've been struggling with some paranoid thoughts. Are you getting help?" The conversation was awkward and eye-opening. Lila had successfully reframed my boundary setting as mental illness, my confrontation of her behavior as paranoid delusions. She'd positioned herself as the concerned friend dealing with someone who was losing touch with reality. This revelation was initially devastating. I felt exposed, humiliated, misunderstood. Part of me wanted to launch a counter-campaign, to tell my side of the story, to prove that I wasn't paranoid or delusional. But I'd learned enough about manipulation to recognize this trap. Engaging in a public battle about who was telling the truth would only make me look more unstable and vindicate Lila's narrative about my mental state. Instead, I chose a different strategy. When people approached me with concern, I thanked them for caring and gave brief, factual responses. "I'm doing well. Lila and I have had some differences about friendship boundaries, but I'm taking care of myself and focusing on my well-being." I didn't defend myself extensively or try to convince anyone of Lila's manipulation. I simply lived my life in a way that demonstrated my stability and good judgment. Over time, my actions spoke louder than her words. The gift of clarity. 3 months after our doorway confrontation, I received a text from Lila. It was my birthday, and her message was carefully crafted to seem loving and concerned while actually being manipulative. "Happy birthday, Tessa. I hope you're doing well and that you found the peace you were looking for. I miss our friendship and think about you often. I'm here if you ever want to talk. I love you." The message was designed to trigger guilt, nostalgia, and the sense that she was the generous one extending an olive branch. It positioned her as loving and patient while implying that I was the one who had destroyed something beautiful. 6 months earlier, this message would have broken my resolve completely. I would have called her immediately, apologized for everything, and begged to return to our old dynamic. But now I could see the manipulation embedded in the apparent kindness. The timing, my birthday, was calculated to catch me in a vulnerable, potentially lonely moment. The language, the peace you were looking for, subtly suggested that my boundary setting had been a selfish pursuit rather than necessary self-protection. The ending, "I love you," was designed to make ignoring the message feel cruel and ungrateful. I didn't respond. This non-response was one of the most difficult things I'd ever done. Every instinct screamed at me to acknowledge her gesture, to at least say thank you, to prove that I wasn't cruel or heartless. But I'd learned that responding to manipulative overtures, even politely, only reinforces the manipulator's belief that they can still access and influence you. The kindest thing I could do, for both of us, was to maintain my boundary consistently. The long road to recovery. Breaking free from Lila's manipulation wasn't a single event. It was a process that took months of work. I had to rebuild my confidence in my own perceptions, learn to trust my internal guidance system, and develop the skills to recognize and resist manipulation in the future. I worked with a therapist who specialized in emotional abuse and trauma bonding. I read books about manipulation tactics and healthy relationships. I practiced setting boundaries with other people in my life and learned to tolerate the discomfort that comes with disappointing others. Most importantly, I had to grieve the friendship I'd thought I had with Lila. Not the manipulative relationship we'd actually had, but the deep, meaningful connection I'd believed existed between us. The loss of that illusion was profound and painful. But in grieving what I'd lost, I also began to understand what I'd gained. Freedom from constant monitoring and approval-seeking. Confidence in my own judgment and perceptions. The ability to make decisions based on my own values rather than someone else's preferences. Relationships based on mutual respect rather than dependency and control. 6 months after our confrontation, I could honestly say that my life was better without Lila in it. Not because she was evil or intentionally malicious, but because our dynamic had been fundamentally unhealthy. She'd needed me to remain dependent and grateful, and I'd needed to become independent and self-trusting. Those needs were incompatible, and recognizing that incompatibility had been the first step toward reclaiming my life. The lessons learned. My experience with Lila taught me several crucial lessons about manipulation, boundaries, and healthy relationships. Manipulation often disguises itself as love. The most dangerous manipulators aren't obviously cruel or selfish. They're the ones who convince you that their control is actually care, their boundary violations are actually devotion, their undermining of your confidence is actually protection. Trust your gut. If a relationship consistently leaves you feeling confused, anxious, or smaller than you were before, pay attention to those feelings. They're often your internal guidance system trying to warn you about dynamics your conscious mind hasn't yet identified. Document your experiences. When someone consistently denies or reframes your shared experiences, having concrete records can protect you from gaslighting and validate your perceptions. Boundaries are not negotiations. Healthy people respect boundaries even when they don't understand or agree with them. People who argue with your boundaries, demand explanations for them, or violate them out of love are showing you that they prioritize their own needs over your autonomy. You don't owe anyone continued access to your life. Gratitude for past kindnesses doesn't obligate you to accept future manipulation. Someone's good intentions don't erase the impact of their harmful behavior. Change is possible, but it requires acknowledgement. People can only change behaviors they're willing to admit exist. Someone who denies their manipulation while promising to change is offering you an empty commitment. You are stronger than you think. The qualities that make you vulnerable to manipulation, empathy, loyalty, the desire to see the best in people, are also strengths that will serve you well in healthy relationships. You don't need to become cynical or closed off to protect yourself. You just need to learn to recognize when those qualities are being exploited. Standing in my doorway that December morning, facing Lila's tears and threats and promises, I had no idea whether I was making the right choice. The doubt and guilt felt overwhelming, and part of me was convinced I was destroying the best friendship I'd ever had. But I'd finally learned to trust myself more than I trusted someone else's version of reality. And that trust, as difficult as it was to maintain in the face of her manipulation, had led me back to my own life. For the first time in months, I was the author of my own story. And that felt like the most important victory of all. Chapter 5. The First Point of Contact. The guilt trip arrived exactly 3 weeks after my confrontation with Lila, disguised as concern from someone I trusted. I was sitting in a coffee shop with my friend Marcus, someone I'd known since college, someone who'd been my steady anchor through career changes, breakups, and family dramas. We'd been catching up on the months we'd lost touch, months when I'd been consumed by my friendship with Lila. When he shifted in his chair and gave me that look. The one that said he had something important to tell me, but wasn't sure how I'd take it. "Tessa," he said carefully, stirring his coffee for the third time. "I need to talk to you about something, and I hope you won't get upset with me." My stomach clenched. After months of navigating Lila's manipulations, I'd become hyper-vigilant about conversations that started with disclaimers about my potential reactions. "What's going on?" I asked. "It's about Lila," he said, and I felt the familiar dread settle in my chest. "She reached out to me last week. She's really worried about you." There it was, the triangulation I'd been expecting but still wasn't prepared for. Lila hadn't just accepted my boundary and moved on. She'd launched what psychologists call a smear campaign, reaching out to mutual friends to control the narrative about our conflict and position herself as the concerned party dealing with someone who was having a breakdown. Triangulation, according to psychology research, is a manipulation tactic where one person uses a third party to avoid direct communication and maintain control over a situation. Instead of respecting my request for space, Lila was using my other relationships to continue her influence over my life. "What did she say?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Marcus looked uncomfortable. "She said you've been isolating yourself, pushing away people who care about you. She mentioned that you've been having some kind of mental health crisis, and that you won't accept help from the people who love you most." I felt the familiar disorientation that came with having my reality reframed by someone else. Here was my friend, someone who'd known me for years, someone who cared about me, repeating Lila's narrative that my boundary setting was evidence of mental illness. This is exactly how guilt tripping works when it's deployed through triangulation. The manipulator doesn't have to confront you directly. Instead, They use mutual friends to deliver their message, making it seem like multiple people are concerned about your behavior rather than just one person being upset about losing control. The psychology of guilt tripping. Dr. George Simon, who has extensively studied manipulation tactics, explains that guilt tripping is a special kind of intimidation tactic, where the manipulator suggests to their target that they do not care enough, are too selfish, or have it too easy. This usually results in the victim feeling bad and keeping them in a self-doubting, anxious, and submissive position. Research shows that guilt tripping is particularly effective because it exploits our natural desire to be seen as caring, loyal, and morally upright. When someone suggests that our actions are hurting them or others, we experience cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable feeling that occurs when our actions don't align with our self-image as good people. Manipulators are experts at weaponizing this discomfort. They understand that most people will modify their behavior to reduce feelings of guilt, even when the guilt is unwarranted or artificially induced. What Lila was doing through Marcus was textbook emotional blackmail, using fear, obligation, and guilt to manipulate my behavior. She was making me feel responsible for her emotional state, positioning my boundary as evidence that I didn't care about her well-being, and using my other relationships to amplify the pressure. "Marcus," I said carefully, "did she mention why I might be pulling away from her specifically?" He hesitated. "She said you two had some kind of misunderstanding, but that she's tried to work things out and you won't communicate with her. She thinks maybe you're going through something that's making it hard for you to maintain your relationships." This was masterful manipulation disguised as compassion. Lila had reframed our entire dynamic, turning my justified boundary into a misunderstanding, my confrontation of her behavior into my inability to communicate, and my request for space into evidence of my mental instability. She'd also positioned herself as the patient, understanding friend who was trying to help, while I was the difficult one who wouldn't accept support. By reaching out to Marcus, she was creating what psychologists call manufactured consensus, making it seem like multiple people shared her concerns about my behavior. The trap of defending yourself. My first instinct was to defend myself, to explain to Marcus what had really happened between Lila and me, to provide evidence of her manipulation tactics. But I'd learned enough about manipulation to recognize this trap. When someone triangulates you, they're betting that you'll either accept their narrative or exhaust yourself trying to prove them wrong. Either response serves their purposes. If you accept their version of events, you return to their control. If you spend your energy defending yourself, you're still giving them attention and power over your emotional state. Dr. Jennifer Degler, who specializes in emotional manipulation, notes that manipulators often use what she calls reputation management to maintain control over their targets. They spread their version of events to mutual friends, making the target feel like they have to choose between defending themselves or allowing false narratives to spread unchallenged. But defending yourself against manipulation often makes you look more unstable, not less. The more frantically you try to explain your side of the story, the more you seem to validate the manipulator's claims that you're having some kind of breakdown. "Marcus," I said, choosing my words carefully, "I appreciate that you care about me, and I understand why Lila's concerns would worry you, but I'm actually doing really well. Lila and I had some differences about friendship boundaries, and I decided I needed space from that relationship. That's not a mental health crisis. That's just a normal life decision." I could see him processing this, comparing my calm demeanor with whatever dramatic narrative Lila had painted for him. "You do seem okay," he said slowly. "Actually, you seem better than you have in months. More like yourself." This was the power of living authentically instead of performing for someone else's approval. The people who knew me well could see the difference between the anxious, uncertain person I'd become during my friendship with Lila and the calmer, more centered person I was becoming in her absence. The guilt campaign escalates. Over the following weeks, more friends reached out with similar concerns. Sarah, my college roommate, called to say she'd heard I was going through a tough time. My coworker Emma mentioned that someone had told her I was struggling with paranoid thoughts. Even my neighbor asked if I was okay, saying she'd heard I was having problems with relationships. This is what experts call a smear campaign, a systematic effort to damage someone's reputation by spreading false or misleading information about them. Lila wasn't just reaching out to one or two people. She was conducting a coordinated campaign to control the narrative about our conflict. The brilliance of her approach was that she never said anything overtly malicious about me. She didn't call me names or make obviously false accusations. Instead, she expressed concern, shared her version of events, and let people draw their own conclusions about my mental state and behavior. Research on psychological manipulation shows that this indirect approach is often more effective than direct attacks. When someone expresses concern about you rather than anger toward you, it's harder to recognize as manipulation. It seems loving, caring, protective, even when it's actually designed to isolate and control you. Dr. Susan Forward, who coined the term emotional blackmail, explains that manipulators often use what she calls the poor me strategy. They position themselves as the victim of your unreasonable behavior, generating sympathy from others while making you look like the aggressor. This was exactly what Lila was doing. She wasn't telling people that I was a bad friend or that she was angry with me. She was telling them that she was worried about me, that she missed our friendship, that she couldn't understand why I was pushing away people who cared about me. The effect was to make me feel guilty for maintaining my boundary, while simultaneously isolating me from my support network. Every conversation became about defending my mental health, rather than discussing the legitimate reasons I'd ended our friendship. The double bind. What made Lila's guilt campaign particularly insidious was the double bind it created. A double bind is a psychological trap where every available response seems to validate the manipulator's narrative. If I defended myself and explained Lila's manipulation tactics, I risked looking paranoid, vindictive, or unstable, exactly what she'd suggested I was. The more evidence I provided of her gaslighting and control, the more it seemed to confirm that I was having some kind of breakdown. If I didn't defend myself and simply said I was fine, people might interpret my calmness as denial or my reluctance to discuss the situation as proof that something was seriously wrong. If I provided specific examples of Lila's behavior, I risked violating her privacy and looking petty or obsessive. If I spoke in generalities, I seemed evasive and unconvincing. This is exactly what emotional blackmail is designed to do. Create situations where every response serves the manipulator's purposes. No matter how you react, you're playing into their narrative about your character, mental state, or motivations. The only way to win this game is not to play it. But that requires a level of emotional detachment that's difficult to maintain when people you care about are questioning your judgment and well-being. The friend who saw through it. Not everyone bought into Lila's narrative. 3 weeks into her guilt campaign, I had coffee with my friend Jenna, someone I'd known since high school. Unlike the others, she didn't start our conversation with expressions of concern about my mental health. "So," she said, settling into her chair with a knowing look, "Lila's been making the rounds, hasn't she?" I felt a rush of relief. Finally, someone who saw what was happening. "She called me last week," Jenna continued. "Spent 45 minutes telling me how worried she is about you, how you're isolating yourself, how you won't accept help. The whole thing felt off to me." "Off how?" I asked. "Well, first of all, I've seen you several times in the past month, and you seem great. Better than great, actually. More relaxed and confident than you've been in ages." So her description of you having some kind of crisis didn't match what I was seeing. This was the power of having friends who knew me independently of Lila, who could provide an outside perspective on her claims about my behavior. But also, Jenna continued, there was something about the way she was talking that bothered me. She kept saying things like, "I've done everything I can for her, and after all I've sacrificed for our friendship." It sounded less like concern and more like entitlement, I guess. Like she felt you owed her something. This was exactly what Dr. George Simon describes as the manipulator's sense of victimhood. Lila wasn't just expressing concern about my well-being. She was positioning herself as the injured party who had been unfairly rejected despite all her generosity and devotion. "Did she say anything specific about what happened between us?" I asked. She was vague about that. Just said you'd had a misunderstanding and that you were overreacting. But here's the thing that really got to me. She asked me to talk to you. She wanted me to convince you to reach out to her, to get help, to stop pushing people away. She was basically asking me to be her messenger. This was triangulation in its purest form. Lila wasn't just spreading her narrative about our conflict. She was actively recruiting people to intervene on her behalf. She was trying to use my other relationships as pressure points to force me back into contact with her. I told her I'd talk to you, Jenna said, but not for the reasons she wanted. I wanted to make sure you knew what she was doing. The relief I felt was overwhelming. For the first time since Lila's campaign began, I felt validated in my perceptions and supported in my decision to maintain boundaries. The research on flying monkeys. What Jenna was describing is what psychology experts call the flying monkey phenomenon, named after the Wizard of Oz characters who did the Wicked Witch's bidding. In manipulation dynamics, flying monkeys are the well-meaning friends and family members who unknowingly carry out the manipulator's agenda. These people aren't malicious. They genuinely believe they're helping. But they've been fed a false narrative about the situation and recruited to apply pressure on the manipulator's behalf. Research shows that manipulators are often skilled at identifying people in their target support network who can be influenced to intervene. They look for friends who are naturally helpful, who dislike conflict, or who have their own guilt triggers that can be exploited. The manipulator usually approaches these people with a carefully crafted story that positions them as the reasonable party dealing with an unreasonable person. They express concern, share selective details, and ask for help in a way that makes the friend feel needed and important. The friend then approaches the target with the manipulator's concerns, usually beginning the conversation with phrases like, "I hope you won't be upset with me for bringing this up," or "I'm only saying this because I care about you." This allows the manipulator to apply pressure while maintaining plausible deniability. If confronted, they can claim they were just expressing concern to mutual friends, not orchestrating a campaign to violate the target's boundaries. The isolation strategy. What made Lila's guilt campaign particularly damaging was how it was designed to isolate me from my support network at the exact moment when I most needed validation and encouragement. Isolation is a key component of psychological manipulation and abuse. When someone's support system is compromised, they become more vulnerable to the manipulator's influence and more likely to return to the toxic relationship to end their loneliness. By spreading concerns about my mental health, Lila was making my friends hesitant to trust my perceptions or validate my decision to end our friendship. Even well-meaning friends became cautious about supporting my boundaries, worried that they might be enabling some kind of breakdown. This created exactly the kind of environment where I might have doubted my own judgment and returned to her for the validation and connection she'd systematically undermined elsewhere. The National Domestic Violence Hotline identifies this as a common tactic in abusive relationships. Partners who behave abusively often intentionally separate their significant other from the people that care about them, because it offers them greater power and control over the relationship. While my friendship with Lila hadn't involved physical abuse, the psychological tactics were remarkably similar. She was using my other relationships as weapons against my autonomy, trying to force me back into a dynamic that had been harmful to my mental health and self-esteem. Learning to respond differently. After my conversation with Jenna, I developed a different strategy for responding to people who approached me with Lila's concerns. Instead of getting defensive or providing lengthy explanations, I kept my responses brief and factual. "I'm doing well, thanks for checking on me." Lila and I had different ideas about friendship boundaries, so I decided to step back from that relationship. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm in a good place." If people pressed for more details, I'd say, "I understand why Lila's version might be concerning, but I'm comfortable with my decision and I'm taking care of myself. I'd rather not get into the specifics, but I appreciate that you care about me." This approach served several purposes. It demonstrated that I was calm and rational, not paranoid or unstable. It acknowledged their concern without validating Lila's narrative. And it avoided getting pulled into a defensive explanation that might make me seem more troubled than I actually was. Most importantly, it refused to engage with the triangulation. I wasn't asking people to choose sides or trying to convince them that Lila was manipulative. I was simply stating my position and letting my behavior speak for itself. Dr. Stephanie Sarkis, who specializes in manipulation tactics, recommends this approach for dealing with smear campaigns. Don't defend yourself extensively. Live your life in a way that demonstrates your stability and good judgment. Over time, your actions will speak louder than their words. The guilt that lingered. Despite my rational understanding of what Lila was doing, the guilt she was generating through my other relationships was still effective. Part of me wondered if I was being too harsh, too unforgiving, too rigid about my boundaries. The friends who reached out were people I cared about, and their concern felt genuine. When Marcus asked if I was sure I was making the right choice, when Sarah wondered if I might regret cutting off someone who cared about me so much, when Emma suggested that maybe I should give Lila another chance. These questions planted seeds of doubt. This is exactly what guilt tripping is designed to do. It doesn't matter if you intellectually understand the manipulation. The emotional impact can still be devastating. The manipulator is betting that your desire to be seen as a good person will override your commitment to protecting yourself. Research on guilt manipulation shows that it's particularly effective on people with high empathy, strong moral values, and a history of prioritizing others' needs over their own. These qualities, which are generally positive, become vulnerabilities that can be exploited by skilled manipulators. I found myself having imaginary conversations with Lila, rehearsing explanations for my behavior, crafting apologies for hurting her feelings. Even though I knew rationally that I'd done nothing wrong, the emotional pressure was constant. The guilt was especially intense because it was coming through people I trusted. When a manipulator attacks you directly, it's easier to recognize and resist. But when they use your loved ones as delivery systems for their message, it feels like the universe itself is telling you that you're wrong. The turning point. The turning point came when I realized that the guilt I was feeling wasn't proportional to anything I'd actually done wrong. I'd ended a friendship that was harmful to my well-being. I'd set a boundary with someone who was manipulating me. I'd protected my mental health and autonomy. These weren't actions that warranted the level of guilt I was experiencing. The guilt was artificial, manufactured, weaponized, and recognizing that helped me resist its influence. I also started paying attention to how I felt after conversations with the friends who'd been contacted by Lila versus those who hadn't. The ones who'd been triangulated into our conflict left me feeling anxious, defensive, and uncertain about my choices. The ones who knew nothing about her campaign left me feeling supported, validated, and confident in my decisions. This wasn't a coincidence. The triangulated friends weren't intentionally harming me, but they'd been turned into conduits for Lila's manipulation. Even their well-meaning concern was serving her agenda to make me doubt myself and return to her control. Understanding this helped me stop taking their questions and concerns so personally. They weren't rejecting my judgment or siding with Lila. They were responding to false information with natural human compassion. The long-term effects. 3 months after Lila's guilt campaign began, most of my friends had stopped bringing her up in conversation. My consistent responses and stable behavior had demonstrated that I wasn't having a mental health crisis, and the novelty of the drama had worn off. A few friends occasionally asked if I'd reconciled with her or if I missed our friendship, but these questions felt more like genuine curiosity than manufactured concern. The pressure to contact her, apologize to her, or explain myself to her had largely disappeared. But the experience had taught me valuable lessons about how manipulation can extend far beyond the primary relationship. Lila had managed to turn my entire social network into a battleground, making every friendship feel potentially compromised and every social interaction feel like a test of my mental stability. This is one of the most insidious aspects of psychological manipulation. It doesn't just damage the relationship between the manipulator and their target. It can poison the target's ability to trust their own perceptions, maintain other relationships, and feel secure in their social connections. The isolation that results isn't just physical or social, it's psychological. You start to question whether anyone really sees you clearly, whether your version of events can be trusted, whether you deserve the loyalty and support of people who care about you. Recovery from this kind of manipulation requires rebuilding not just your relationship with yourself, but your faith in your ability to maintain healthy relationships with others. It requires learning to distinguish between genuine concern and manufactured pressure, between support and control, between love and manipulation. The guilt campaign was ultimately unsuccessful in getting me to return to Lila, but it was highly successful in teaching me how sophisticated and far-reaching manipulation tactics can be. It showed me that protecting yourself from one manipulative person isn't enough. You also have to protect yourself from the ways they can use your other relationships against you. 6 months later, I could see that surviving Lila's guilt campaign had made me stronger, more discerning, and more confident in my ability to maintain boundaries even under pressure. But I also understood that this strength had come at a significant cost. Months of questioning myself, defending my choices, and feeling like I had to prove my sanity to people I loved. The experience had revealed something important about manipulation. It's not just about what happens between you and the manipulator. It's about how they can weaponize your entire social world against your autonomy and well-being. And recognizing that broader pattern is essential to protecting yourself from the full scope of their influence. In the end, the friends who truly knew me saw through Lila's narrative. The ones who were more easily influenced gradually lost interest in her drama. And I learned that maintaining boundaries isn't just about saying no to one person. It's about saying no to all the ways that person can try to access and control you through others. The guilt campaign had been Lila's most sophisticated attempt to regain control over me. Its failure marked the beginning of my complete psychological freedom from her influence. Chapter 6, The Central Point. For months after my confrontation with Lila, the silence began. Not the comfortable kind of silence that comes after resolving a conflict, but the weaponized kind that arrives like a storm system. Deliberate, suffocating, and designed to break you down. It started subtly, as these things do. A missed text here, an unreturned call there. But gradually, it became clear that I was being subjected to what psychologists call the silent treatment, one of the most psychologically damaging forms of emotional manipulation. The irony wasn't lost on me. After months of being overwhelmed by Lila's constant attention, her manipulation tactics, and her guilt campaigns, I found myself facing the opposite extreme: complete emotional withdrawal. But this wasn't the peaceful absence I'd requested when I asked for space. This was punishment. The silent treatment, according to research, is a deliberate passive-aggressive manipulation tactic designed to control, devalue, and punish the target. Unlike healthy space-taking, which involves communication about needs and boundaries, the silent treatment is implemented without explanation and continues indefinitely until the target submits to the manipulator's will. Dr. Kipling Williams, a social psychologist who has extensively studied ostracism, explains that the silent treatment is the most common form of social rejection and activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. When someone deliberately ignores us, our brains interpret it as a threat to our survival, triggering intense psychological distress. But understanding the psychology behind Lila's behavior didn't make experiencing it any less devastating. The anatomy of silence. The silent treatment began approximately 2 weeks after Lila's guilt campaign through mutual friends had failed to bring me back into her orbit. When it became clear that I wasn't going to be guilted into resuming our friendship, she switched tactics entirely. At first, I barely noticed it. Lila and I hadn't been in direct contact since our confrontation, so her absence from my daily life felt normal, even peaceful. But gradually, I began to realize that the silence was more comprehensive than I'd initially understood. She wasn't just not contacting me. She was actively avoiding any situation where we might encounter each other. She stopped frequenting the coffee shop where we used to meet. She changed her gym schedule to avoid our usual overlapping workout times. She even stopped attending social events where she knew I'd be present. This kind of systematic avoidance is what researchers call relational aggression, using the relationship itself as a weapon to cause psychological harm. By making her absence conspicuous and deliberate, Lila was communicating her displeasure more loudly than any words could have conveyed. But the most insidious aspect of her silent treatment was how it affected my other relationships. Mutual friends began to notice the tension and started walking on eggshells around both of us. Social events became awkward minefields where people felt like they had to choose sides or manage competing loyalties. Dr. John Gottman, who has extensively studied relationship dynamics, identifies stonewalling, the therapeutic term for the silent treatment, as one of the 4 horsemen that predict relationship breakdown. But when it's used deliberately as punishment rather than as an overwhelmed response to conflict, it becomes a form of emotional abuse. The difference lies in intent and communication. Healthy space-taking involves letting the other person know you need time to process, setting a time frame for reconnection, and returning to address the issue when emotions have cooled. Abusive silent treatment, by contrast, is implemented without explanation, continues indefinitely, and is designed to force the target into submission. What Lila was doing was clearly the latter. The psychological impact. Research shows that being deliberately ignored activates the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the same brain region that processes physical pain. This explains why the silent treatment feels so physically uncomfortable, like being punched in the gut or having your heart squeezed. But the pain isn't just momentary. Studies indicate that sustained social rejection can lead to a cascade of psychological effects, including anxiety, depression, decreased self-esteem, and even compromised immune function. The uncertainty inherent in the silent treatment, not knowing when or if normal communication will resume, creates a state of chronic stress that can be debilitating. I began experiencing these effects within the first month of Lila's campaign. Despite having initiated our separation and despite knowing intellectually that her behavior was manipulative, I found myself obsessing over her absence. I checked social media compulsively to see if she'd posted anything that might give me insight into her emotional state. I drove past places where I might see her, telling myself it was coincidental. I found myself crafting mental messages I might send to break the silence, then deleting them before I could act on impulse. This is exactly what the silent treatment is designed to achieve. According to Dr. Stephanie Sarkis, who has written extensively about emotional abuse, the silent treatment keeps you in a state of anxiety and uncertainty, making you focus on the person who's ignoring you rather than on your own healing and growth. The manipulator doesn't have to do anything. They just have to refuse to do anything. The target does all the work, expending mental and emotional energy trying to figure out how to end the standoff, what they did wrong, and how they can fix things. But the most damaging aspect of Lila's silent treatment wasn't the direct impact on me. It was how it contaminated my entire social environment. The ripple effects. When someone implements the silent treatment in a social group, it creates what psychologists call relational turbulence. The silence doesn't just affect the primary relationship. It destabilizes the entire network of connections surrounding both parties. Our mutual friends found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't invite both of us to events without risking awkwardness or conflict, so they began hosting separate gatherings or simply stopped including one or both of us in social plans. Some friends tried to maintain neutrality, but found themselves inadvertently taking sides based on whose version of events they found more compelling. Others attempted to play peacemaker, suggesting that we work things out or talk through our differences, without understanding the manipulative dynamics that had made such conversations impossible. These well-meaning interventions often made things worse, as they reinforced Lila's narrative that I was being stubborn or unreasonable by maintaining my boundaries. The social fragmentation was particularly painful because it compounded the isolation I was already experiencing from Lila's direct silent treatment. Not only was I dealing with the psychological effects of being deliberately ignored by someone who had once been central to my life, but I was also losing access to social connections and community activities that had provided meaning and joy. This is exactly what manipulative silence is designed to achieve. According to research on emotional abuse, the silent treatment often serves multiple functions simultaneously. It punishes the target for their transgression. It demonstrates the manipulator's power to control social dynamics, and it increases the social cost of maintaining boundaries, making submission seem like the easier option. Dr. Laura Howe, who studies withholding behaviors in relationships, explains that withholding is an expression of conditional love, whereby the withholder refuses to provide their partner with an emotional or physical need unless certain conditions are met. In Lila's case, the condition was clear: resume our friendship on her terms, or continue to be shut out from not just her presence, but from the broader social world we'd once shared. The temptation to break. 3 months into Lila's silent treatment, I was exhausted. The psychological toll of being deliberately ignored, combined with the social isolation and constant second-guessing of my decision to end our friendship, had worn down my resolve. I found myself romanticizing our past connection and minimizing the manipulation I'd experienced. Maybe I had been too harsh in my confrontation. Maybe her behavior hadn't been as problematic as I'd thought. Maybe I was being stubborn and unforgiving by maintaining such rigid boundaries. This is exactly what the silent treatment is designed to do. Wear down the target's resistance until they're willing to accept any terms just to end the psychological torture. Research shows that prolonged social rejection can compromise decision-making abilities, making people more likely to engage in risky or self-destructive behaviors just to regain social connection. The urge to reach out became almost overwhelming. I drafted dozens of messages, apologies, explanations, attempts at reconciliation, but some small part of me remembered why I'd ended our friendship in the first place. I reread my journal entries from the months when I'd been under her influence, reminding myself of the confusion, anxiety, and loss of self I'd experienced. This documentation became my anchor. When the silent treatment made me question my own memories and perceptions, I had concrete evidence of what our relationship had actually been like. The patterns of gaslighting, manipulation, and control were all there in black and white, written in my own hand during the times when I'd been too confused to trust my own experience. The support that saved me. What ultimately helped me resist the urge to break my boundaries was the support system I'd built outside of Lila's influence. The friends who hadn't been triangulated into our conflict, the therapist I'd started seeing, and my sister who lived across the country. These were the people who helped me maintain perspective when the silent treatment made me doubt everything. My therapist was particularly instrumental in helping me understand what was happening. She explained that the silent treatment is often the final escalation in a pattern of emotional manipulation, used when other tactics have failed to regain control over the target. The person implementing silent treatment is betting that you'll find the silence more uncomfortable than returning to the problematic relationship, she explained. They're using your own empathy and need for connection against you. She also helped me recognize that the intensity of my distress about being ignored was partly due to trauma bonding, the powerful attachment that forms when someone alternates between providing comfort and causing distress. My brain had become addicted to Lila's approval and attention, making her withdrawal feel like a genuine emergency rather than a predictable consequence of setting healthy boundaries. This understanding helped me reframe my experience. Instead of seeing my distress as evidence that I'd made the wrong choice, I began to see it as evidence of how deeply the manipulative relationship had affected my neural pathways and stress responses. The behavioral patterns. As the silent treatment continued, I began to notice patterns in Lila's behavior that revealed the calculated nature of her approach. This wasn't someone who was simply too hurt or angry to communicate. This was someone who was strategically using silence as a weapon. She would appear at social events where she knew I'd be present, but would refuse to acknowledge my existence. She'd carry on animated conversations with mutual friends while pointedly ignoring me, even when I was standing just a few feet away. She'd post cheerful updates on social media about her wonderful life and amazing friends, making sure to tag people from our mutual social circle while conspicuously excluding me. These behaviors are what psychologists call demonstrative avoidance, making the silent treatment visible and public to maximize its psychological impact. Instead of simply avoiding contact, she was making sure I knew I was being avoided, and that others knew it too. The public nature of her silent treatment served multiple purposes. It communicated to our social circle that I was persona non grata. It demonstrated her power to control social dynamics, and it increased the social pressure on me to capitulate to end the awkwardness for everyone involved. But perhaps most insidiously, it allowed her to maintain plausible deniability about her behavior. If confronted, she could claim she wasn't doing anything to me. She was simply living her life and choosing not to engage with someone who had hurt her. The manipulation was hidden behind a veneer of wounded dignity and self-protection. The isolation deepens. By the 4th month of Lila's silent treatment, I realized that my social circle had effectively split in two. There were events I no longer felt comfortable attending because I knew she'd be there, radiating hostility and making everyone uncomfortable. There were friends who had stopped inviting me to gatherings because including me meant dealing with the awkwardness of her refusal to acknowledge my presence. This social isolation compounded the psychological effects of the direct silent treatment. Research shows that social exclusion activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. But when that exclusion extends to multiple relationships and social contexts, the effects can be devastating. I began to understand why some people break under the pressure of sustained silent treatment. The combination of direct rejection, social isolation, and constant uncertainty creates a perfect storm of psychological distress that can overwhelm even the strongest person's coping mechanisms. The silence also gave me too much time to think. Without the distraction of regular social interaction, I found myself ruminating obsessively about our friendship, analyzing every interaction for clues about what I might have done differently, crafting elaborate scenarios for how we might reconcile. This rumination is exactly what the silent treatment is designed to produce. The manipulator wants their target to become obsessed with them, to spend mental and emotional energy trying to figure out how to end the standoff. It keeps them psychologically present even when they're physically absent. Learning to live in the silence. The turning point came when I stopped trying to fill the silence and started learning to live within it. Instead of checking social media compulsively to see what Lila was doing, I deleted the apps from my phone. Instead of driving past places where I might see her, I deliberately chose different routes. Instead of asking mutual friends about her or trying to get information about her state of mind, I changed the subject when her name came up in conversation. This wasn't easy. The urge to seek information about someone who's giving you the silent treatment is almost overwhelming. It's like trying not to touch a painful wound. But research shows that breaking the obsessive focus on the person who's ignoring you is essential for psychological recovery. I also began to reconstruct my social life around connections that weren't contaminated by our conflict. I reached out to old friends who had never been part of our shared social circle. I joined new activities where I could meet people who had no history with our drama. I invested more deeply in the relationships that had remained stable and supportive throughout this ordeal. Slowly, I began to remember who I was outside of my relationship with Lila. The constant anxiety about her approval or disapproval began to fade. The urge to reach out and break the silence became less frequent and less intense. Most importantly, I began to recognize that the peace I felt when I wasn't trying to manage her emotions or navigate her manipulation was worth protecting. The silence that had initially felt like punishment gradually began to feel like freedom. The manipulation revealed. 6 months into Lila's silent treatment, something happened that revealed the true nature of her behavior. A mutual friend, Emma, approached me at a coffee shop with a troubled expression. "I need to tell you something," she said, glancing around as if she was worried about being overheard. "It's about Lila." My stomach clenched. After months of silence, any mention of her name still triggered anxiety. "She's been asking me to give you messages," Emma continued. "Things like how much she misses you, how hurt she is by your refusal to communicate, how she wishes you could work things out. She keeps asking me to tell you that she's open to talking if you are." This revelation was stunning. For 6 months, I'd believed that Lila was maintaining complete silence, that she was so hurt or angry that she couldn't bring herself to communicate with me at all. But she'd been communicating, just not directly. This is what manipulation experts call triangulated silent treatment, using third parties to maintain psychological pressure while appearing to maintain the moral high ground of not initiating contact. She'd been having her cake and eating it too, punishing me with silence while simultaneously sending messages designed to make me feel guilty for not reaching out to her. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her that if she wanted to talk to you, she should reach out directly," Emma said. "But she keeps insisting that you're the one who needs to make the first move because you're the one who ended the friendship." This was classic manipulation, positioning herself as the injured party who was graciously open to reconciliation while making it clear that any overture would have to come from me. She was maintaining the silent treatment while simultaneously using it to extract compliance. The discovery of her indirect communication made me realize that the silence had never been about being too hurt to speak. It had always been about control. She was using the silent treatment strategically, calculating its effects, and supplementing it with indirect pressure to maximize its impact. The end of illusions. Emma's revelation was liberating because it shattered the last of my illusions about Lila's behavior. I could no longer tell myself that she was simply processing her emotions or protecting herself from further hurt. The evidence was clear. She was deliberately manipulating our mutual friends to maintain psychological pressure on me while avoiding any accountability for her actions. This understanding helped me stop personalizing her behavior. The silent treatment wasn't really about me or anything I'd done wrong. It was about her need to maintain control and her unwillingness to accept that I had the right to end our friendship. Research on manipulation tactics shows that the silent treatment is often the last resort of someone who has lost other forms of control over their target. When guilt trips, gaslighting, and social pressure fail to bring the person back into line, manipulators often escalate to complete withdrawal, betting that the target will find the silence unbearable and return to the relationship on any terms. But I'd reached a point where the silence was no longer unbearable. In fact, it had become preferable to the alternative of returning to a relationship dynamic that had been damaging my mental health and sense of self. Reclaiming my life. The final phase of dealing with Lila's silent treatment involved fully reclaiming the life I'd been building outside of her influence. This meant not just tolerating her absence, but actively embracing it. I stopped monitoring mutual friends for information about her activities or emotional state. I stopped changing my plans to avoid potential encounters with her. I stopped feeling guilty about enjoying social events where she wasn't present. Most importantly, I stopped waiting for her to change her behavior or acknowledge the harm she'd caused. The silent treatment had taught me that I couldn't control her actions, but I could control my responses to them. Dr. Stephanie Sarkis advises that the best response to manipulative silent treatment is to live your life in a way that demonstrates your stability and good judgment. Don't chase after someone who's ignoring you. Focus on the relationships and activities that bring you joy and fulfillment. This became my strategy. Instead of trying to end the silence, I learned to thrive within it. Instead of seeing it as punishment, I began to see it as protection. Protection from manipulation, gaslighting, and emotional abuse. The unexpected gift. 9 months after Lila's silent treatment began, I realized that it had become one of the most valuable experiences of my recovery from our toxic friendship. Not because the experience itself was positive, it was genuinely distressing and psychologically damaging, but because surviving it had taught me crucial lessons about my own resilience and the nature of manipulative relationships. The silent treatment had forced me to develop independence from external validation. When someone who had once been my primary source of approval suddenly withdrew all feedback, I had to learn to trust my own judgment and find validation from within. This was painful but ultimately liberating. It had also clarified the difference between healthy solitude and punitive isolation. The peace I felt when I wasn't walking on eggshells around Lila's moods and manipulations was genuine solitude, restorative, chosen, and nourishing. The anxiety I felt from her deliberate silence was punitive isolation, weaponized, imposed, and depleting. Most importantly, the silent treatment had revealed the full extent of Lila's manipulative capabilities. By escalating to this extreme tactic, she'd shown me exactly what I'd been dealing with and validated my decision to end our friendship. Someone who would use such psychologically damaging tactics to maintain control was not someone I wanted in my life, regardless of our shared history or the positive aspects of our connection. The long-term effects. A year after Lila's silent treatment began, I could see its lasting effects on my life, both positive and negative. On the negative side, I'd become more cautious about forming close friendships, particularly with people who showed early signs of manipulative tendencies. I was hypervigilant about love bombing, boundary violations, and attempts to isolate me from other relationships. This caution was protective, but sometimes prevented me from fully embracing new connections. I also struggled with a form of hypervigilance around social rejection. Having experienced the deliberate, sustained silence from someone I'd cared about deeply, I was more sensitive to signs that others might be withdrawing from me. This made me more anxious in relationships and more likely to interpret normal fluctuations in communication as signs of impending abandonment. But the positive effects far outweighed the negative ones. I developed a much stronger sense of my own worth independent of external validation. I'd learned to distinguish between healthy relationship dynamics and manipulative ones. I'd built a support network of people who respected my boundaries and supported my growth rather than trying to control or manipulate me. Most importantly, I'd learned that I could survive the worst form of social rejection and emerge stronger on the other side. The silent treatment that was supposed to break me down and force me back into Lila's control had instead taught me that I was more resilient than I'd ever imagined. The wisdom of silence. 2 years after Lila's silent treatment began, I understood something that would have seemed impossible when I was in the thick of experiencing it. Sometimes silence is the kindest thing someone can give you. Not the weaponized silence designed to punish and control, but the clean silence that comes when someone who isn't good for you removes themselves from your life. Lila's refusal to communicate had initially felt like torture, but it had ultimately been a gift. The gift of freedom from someone who had been systematically undermining my mental health and autonomy. Her silence had forced me to stop hoping for change, acknowledgement, or repair. It had made me face the reality that some relationships can't be fixed and that sometimes walking away, or being walked away from, is the healthiest option for everyone involved. The manipulator's silence is designed to make you chase them, beg for their attention, and submit to their control. But when you stop chasing and start living, their silence transforms from a weapon into a liberation. I never did reach out to break the silence. And eventually, I stopped wanting to. The central point of my story, the moment when everything shifted from external drama to internal transformation, wasn't when Lila launched her guilt campaign or when she began her silent treatment. It was when I stopped trying to manage her behavior and started focusing on my own healing. The silence that was meant to destroy me had instead taught me the most valuable lesson of all, that I was complete and worthy with or without anyone else's approval, attention, or presence in my life. And that realization changed everything. Dr. Stephanie Sarkis advises that the best response to manipulative silent treatment is to live your life in a way that demonstrates your stability and good judgment. Don't chase after someone who's ignoring you. Focus on the relationships and activities that bring you joy and fulfillment. This became my strategy. Instead of trying to end the silence, I learned to thrive within it. Instead of seeing it as punishment, I began to see it as protection. Protection from manipulation, gaslighting, and emotional abuse. The unexpected gift. 9 months after Lila's silent treatment began, I realized that it had become one of the most valuable experiences of my recovery from our toxic friendship. Not because the experience itself was positive, it was genuinely distressing and psychologically damaging, but because surviving it had taught me crucial lessons about my own resilience and the nature of manipulative relationships. The silent treatment had forced me to develop independence from external validation. When someone who had once been my primary source of approval suddenly withdrew all feedback, I had to learn to trust my own judgment and find validation from within. This was painful but ultimately liberating. It had also clarified the difference between healthy solitude and punitive isolation. The peace I felt when I wasn't walking on eggshells around Lila's moods and manipulations was genuine solitude, restorative, chosen, and nourishing. The anxiety I felt from her deliberate silence was punitive isolation, weaponized, imposed, and depleting. Most importantly, the silent treatment had revealed the full extent of Lila's manipulative capabilities. By escalating to this extreme tactic, she'd shown me exactly what I'd been dealing with and validated my decision to end our friendship. Someone who would use such psychologically damaging tactics to maintain control was not someone I wanted in my life, regardless of our shared history or the positive aspects of our connection. The long-term effects. A year after Lila's silent treatment began, I could see its lasting effects on my life, both positive and negative. On the negative side, I'd become more cautious about forming close friendships, particularly with people who showed early signs of manipulative tendencies. I was hypervigilant about love bombing, boundary violations, and attempts to isolate me from other relationships. This caution was protective, but sometimes prevented me from fully embracing new connections. I also struggled with a form of hypervigilance around social rejection. Having experienced the deliberate, sustained silence from someone I'd cared about deeply, I was more sensitive to signs that others might be withdrawing from me. This made me more anxious in relationships and more likely to interpret normal fluctuations in communication as signs of impending abandonment. But the positive effects far outweighed the negative ones. I developed a much stronger sense of my own worth independent of external validation. I'd learned to distinguish between healthy relationship dynamics and manipulative ones. I'd built a support network of people who respected my boundaries and supported my growth rather than trying to control or manipulate me. Most importantly, I'd learned that I could survive the worst form of social rejection and emerge stronger on the other side. The silent treatment that was supposed to break me down and force me back into Lila's control had instead taught me that I was more resilient than I'd ever imagined. The wisdom of silence. 2 years after Lila's silent treatment began, I understood something that would have seemed impossible when I was in the thick of experiencing it. Sometimes silence is the kindest thing someone can give you. Not the weaponized silence designed to punish and control, but the clean silence that comes when someone who isn't good for you removes themselves from your life. Lila's refusal to communicate had initially felt like torture, but it had ultimately been a gift. the gift of freedom from someone who had been systematically undermining my mental health and autonomy. Her silence had forced me to stop hoping for change, acknowledgement, or repair. It had made me face the reality that some relationships can't be fixed and that sometimes walking away, or being walked away from, is the healthiest option for everyone involved. The manipulator's silence is designed to make you chase them, beg for their attention, and submit to their control. But when you stop chasing and start living, their silence transforms from a weapon into a liberation. I never did reach out to break the silence. And eventually, I stopped wanting to. The central point of my story, the moment when everything shifted from external drama to internal transformation, wasn't when Lila launched her guilt campaign or when she began her silent treatment. It was when I stopped trying to manage her behavior and started focusing on my own healing. The silence that was meant to destroy me had instead taught me the most valuable lesson of all, that I was complete and worthy with or without anyone else's approval, attention, or presence in my life. And that realization changed everything. Chapter 7. The second point of contact. The passive-aggressive assault began 6 months after Lila's silent treatment had established its suffocating grip on my social world. By then, I'd grown accustomed to the cold silence, the deliberate avoidance, the manufactured awkwardness at social gatherings. I'd learned to navigate around the void she'd created, rebuilding my life in the spaces she couldn't contaminate with her presence. But Lila was nothing if not adaptive in her manipulation tactics. When the silent treatment failed to bring me back into her orbit, when my refusal to chase her approval became clear, she shifted strategies with the calculated precision of a chess master moving into the endgame. The passive aggression that followed was perhaps more insidious than anything that had come before. A campaign of subtle hostility disguised as civility, designed to undermine my confidence and social standing without ever being overtly confrontational. It was manipulation refined to an art form, so sophisticated that even I, after months of studying her tactics, almost missed it in the beginning. The first incident happened at Emma's birthday party, 7 months after our confrontation. I debated whether to attend, knowing Lila would likely be there, but I decided I wouldn't let her continued presence in our social circle prevent me from maintaining my other friendships. I'd steeled myself for more silent treatment, more conspicuous avoidance, more of the chilly hostility that had become her signature response to my existence. What I encountered instead was far more unsettling. The art of covert aggression. "Tessa," Lila called out cheerfully when she spotted me across Emma's living room. "You look so much better than the last time I saw you. I'm so glad you're taking care of yourself." The room seemed to pause momentarily, not because of any overt drama, but because everyone who knew about our conflict was surprised to hear her speaking to me at all. But her tone was friendly, concerned, appropriate. To anyone who didn't know our history, it would have sounded like a normal greeting between old friends. To me, it sounded like a precision strike. The comment contained several layers of manipulation wrapped in apparent kindness. By saying I looked better than the last time, she was implying I'd looked unwell previously, subtly reinforcing her narrative that I'd been having mental health struggles. By expressing gladness that I was taking care of myself, she was positioning herself as someone who'd been worried about my well-being, someone magnanimous enough to be pleased by my recovery. Most insidiously, she was forcing me into an impossible social position. I could either ignore her comment and seem rude in front of our mutual friends, or respond politely and tacitly accept her framing of our dynamic. This is what psychologists term covert aggression. The use of calculating, underhanded means to manipulate others while keeping aggressive intentions hidden. Unlike true passive aggression, which involves resisting through noncompliance, covert aggression is active manipulation disguised as something benign or even caring. Dr. George Simon, who has extensively studied manipulative personalities, explains that covert aggressors are wolves in sheep's clothing. They use socially acceptable behaviors to mask hostile intentions. They understand that overt aggression would be recognized and rejected, so they operate through subtlety, innuendo, and plausible deniability. "Thanks," I replied carefully, keeping my voice neutral. "I'm doing well." "I'm so happy to hear that," she said, her voice carrying just the right note of relief. "I know you've been going through such a difficult time." There it was again, the implication that I'd been struggling, that my well-being had been her concern, that she was the caring friend monitoring my recovery from some unspecified crisis. Anyone listening would hear compassion and friendship. I heard the continuation of her smear campaign, now delivered with a smile. The psychology of backhanded compliments. Over the following weeks, as Lila's new strategy became clear, I began to recognize the sophisticated psychological manipulation embedded in her approach. Research on backhanded compliments reveals them to be a distinct form of aggression that serves dual purposes: undermining the target while making the aggressor appear concerned or supportive. Studies show that backhanded compliments follow a specific formula. They begin with what appears to be praise, then include a comparison to a negative standard that undermines the apparent positivity. You look great for your age. That's a smart idea for someone without experience. You handled that well for someone who usually struggles with confrontation. The brilliance of this tactic lies in its deniability. If confronted, the person delivering the backhanded compliment can claim they were being supportive, focusing on the positive portion of their statement while ignoring the implicit criticism. The target is left feeling simultaneously praised and insulted, often doubting their own interpretation of the interaction. Research indicates that recipients of backhanded compliments experience decreased positive emotions and increased feelings of being insulted, even when they intellectually understand that the speaker intended to be complimentary. The negative comparison embedded in the statement overshadows the positive elements, leaving the target feeling diminished rather than uplifted. But perhaps most damaging is the effect on motivation and self-perception. Studies show that backhanded compliments successfully reduce recipients' motivation to succeed by implicitly placing them lower in social hierarchies. When someone says, "Your presentation was good for someone with your background," they're not just commenting on a single performance. They're defining your place in a broader distribution of competence. This was exactly what Lila was doing, but with the added sophistication of someone who'd had months to refine her approach. The campaign unfolds. The pattern became clear over several weeks of social encounters. Lila would approach interactions with me in a way that appeared friendly and appropriate to observers, but carried multiple layers of subtle aggression designed to undermine my social standing and psychological stability. At Marcus's housewarming party, "Tessa, you seem so much more stable lately. I'm proud of you for working through whatever you were dealing with." At the coffee shop where we'd once spent countless hours together, "It's so good to see you out and about. I know social situations have been challenging for you." At a group dinner, "I love how you're expressing your opinions more. It's wonderful to see you finding your voice again." Each comment followed the same formula: apparent support for my well-being, combined with implications about previous instability, framed as observations from someone who cared about my recovery. To casual observers, she seemed like a thoughtful friend celebrating my improvement. To me, she was systematically reinforcing her narrative that I'd been mentally unstable and was only now recovering under her benevolent observation. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. After each encounter, I found myself questioning my own perceptions, wondering if I really had seemed unstable before, doubting whether my current sense of well-being was as solid as I'd believed. The comments triggered the same self-doubt and confusion that had characterized the gaslighting phase of our relationship. This is exactly what covert aggression is designed to achieve. According to research, victims of passive-aggressive behavior often experience increased anxiety, self-doubt, and confusion because the aggression is subtle enough to be deniable, but persistent enough to be destabilizing. Dr. Preston and I, who studies passive-aggressive behavior, notes that covert aggressors are experts at making their targets feel like they're the problem. They use techniques like selective memory, strategic timing, and emotional manipulation to keep their victims off balance and uncertain about reality. The social manipulation. What made Lila's passive-aggressive campaign particularly effective was how it leveraged social dynamics to amplify its impact. She wasn't just undermining me in private conversations. She was doing it in public settings where her comments would be witnessed by mutual friends and incorporated into their understanding of our relationship dynamic. By consistently framing me as someone recovering from instability, she was shaping how others interpreted my behavior and responses. If I seemed upset by her comments, it could be attributed to my sensitivity during recovery. If I avoided her, it reinforced the narrative that I was still struggling with social situations. If I confronted her behavior, it would seem like an overreaction to her well-meaning concern. This is what psychologists call triangulation through reputation management. using public interactions to control how third parties perceive a conflict. Instead of directly telling people I was unstable, she was demonstrating her concern for my recovery, allowing observers to draw their own conclusions about what I might be recovering from. The strategy was particularly insidious because it exploited the social discomfort around mental health issues. Most people don't know how to respond when someone appears to be discussing another person's psychological struggles, even when that discussion is framed as supportive. The result was that our mutual friends became increasingly uncomfortable around both of us, unsure how to navigate conversations that seemed to carry hidden meanings and unspoken implications. Research on social manipulation shows that this kind of reputation management can be devastatingly effective, especially when the manipulator is skilled at appearing concerned rather than critical. People tend to give the benefit of the doubt to someone who seems to be expressing care, even when something feels off about their approach. The escalation pattern. As weeks passed, Lila's passive-aggressive comments became more frequent and more pointed. She seemed to be testing how far she could push without triggering obvious retaliation. Each successful interaction emboldened her to be slightly more aggressive in the next encounter. At Sarah's book club, Tessa's really participating in discussions now. It's so different from when she was going through that rough patch. At the gym, I'm glad you're working out again. Exercise is so important for mental health, isn't it? At a mutual friend's wedding, you look radiant, so much more like your old self. I was worried about you for a while there. The comments were escalating in their implications about my previous mental state while maintaining the same veneer of caring concern. She was creating a fictional narrative about my psychological journey, from instability through recovery to current well-being, and positioning herself as the caring observer who'd monitored this entire process. This escalation pattern is characteristic of passive-aggressive behavior, according to research. Covert aggressors often begin with subtle probes to test their target's reactions and the social environment's tolerance for their behavior. When they encounter no consequences, they gradually increase the frequency and intensity of their aggression. Dr. Martha Stout, who studies manipulative personalities, explains that this gradual escalation serves multiple purposes. It allows the aggressor to maintain plausible deniability. It desensitizes both the target and observers to the hostile behavior, and it creates a sense of learned helplessness in the target who feels unable to effectively respond. The impossible response. What made Lila's passive-aggressive campaign so psychologically damaging was how it created what researchers call a double bind. A situation where every possible response seemed to validate her narrative about my character and mental state. If I ignored her comments, I appeared to be avoiding social interaction, which could be interpreted as continued social anxiety or inability to handle normal friendships. If I responded politely, I was tacitly accepting her framing of our dynamic and her authority to comment on my mental health. If I confronted her directly, I risked appearing aggressive, oversensitive, or mentally unstable, exactly what she'd been implying all along. This is the hallmark of sophisticated manipulation, creating scenarios where the target cannot win, no matter how they respond. Every reaction becomes evidence supporting the manipulator's narrative, while the manipulator maintains the appearance of innocence or concern. Research on double binds shows that they're particularly effective at inducing learned helplessness and anxiety in targets. When people consistently find themselves in no-win situations, they often stop trying to respond effectively and instead become passive or avoidant, which typically makes the manipulation worse. I found myself dreading social events where Lila might be present, not because of her continued silent treatment, but because of these carefully crafted verbal assaults disguised as friendship. The unpredictability of when and how she might strike made every social interaction feel like a potential minefield. The turning point. The moment that changed everything happened at Emma's birthday party. Ironically, the same venue where Lila's passive-aggressive campaign had begun. I'd been avoiding her successfully for most of the evening when she approached me near the dessert table, away from most of the other guests. "Tessa," she said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of concerned friendship. "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I've been thinking about our friendship a lot lately." My stomach clenched. This sounded like the prelude to another carefully crafted attack. "I know things ended badly between us," she continued, "and I take responsibility for my part in that. I think we were both going through difficult times and didn't handle the conflict well. This was new, an apparent acknowledgement of fault, an olive branch of sorts. But after months of studying her manipulation tactics, I was hypersensitive to the subtle ways she twisted language to serve her purposes. "I've been watching you recover and rebuild," she said, "and I'm so proud of how far you've come. You seem so much more stable and confident. It makes me think that maybe we could try to repair our friendship, now that you're in a better place to handle it." There it was, the most sophisticated manipulation she'd attempted yet. She was offering reconciliation while simultaneously reinforcing every element of her narrative about my previous instability. She was positioning herself as the mature one willing to forgive past conflicts, while suggesting that my previous inability to handle our friendship had been due to my mental state rather than her manipulative behavior. But this time, instead of feeling confused or destabilized by her words, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months of dealing with her various manipulation tactics. Clarity. The response that changed everything. "Lila," I said, my voice steady and calm, "I appreciate that you're reaching out, but I'm not interested in repairing our friendship." She blinked, clearly not expecting such a direct response. "Oh," she said, her concerned expression flickering slightly. "Can I ask why? I thought we might be able to work through our differences now that you're feeling better." "Because," I said, meeting her eyes directly, "our friendship wasn't healthy for me, and ending it was one of the best decisions I've made for my well-being. I'm not recovering from anything. I'm thriving without the dynamics that characterized our relationship." The change in her expression was subtle but unmistakable. The mask of concern slipped just enough to reveal the calculation underneath. "I see," she said, her voice cooling slightly. "I had hoped that with time and perspective, you might be able to see things more objectively. But I understand that some people need more time to process difficult experiences." Even in the face of direct rejection, she couldn't resist one final attempt at manipulation, implying that my refusal was evidence of incomplete processing rather than healthy boundary setting. But I'd learned something crucial in the months since our original confrontation. I didn't need to convince her of anything. I didn't need to defend my perspective or justify my boundaries. I didn't need to engage with her attempts to reframe my decisions as symptoms of instability. "I hope you have a good evening," I said and walked away. The liberation of clarity. What happened in that conversation marked a fundamental shift in my ability to recognize and resist manipulation. For the first time since our conflict began, I'd encountered one of Lila's tactics and immediately understood what was happening, why it was happening, and how to respond effectively. The months of studying manipulation tactics, documenting her behavior patterns, and working with my therapist to understand the psychological dynamics had finally crystallized into practical wisdom. I could see through her apparent concern to the hostile intentions underneath. I could recognize the double binds she was trying to create and refused to be trapped by them. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my own perceptions over her narrative about my mental state and our relationship history. The confidence I felt in that moment wasn't fragile or dependent on external validation. It was solid, grounded in self-knowledge and emotional intelligence. Research on recovery from manipulative relationships shows that this kind of clarity is often the turning point in the healing process. When targets can recognize manipulation tactics in real time and respond from a place of strength rather than confusion, they've essentially immunized themselves against future attempts at control. Dr. Stephanie Sarkis, who specializes in manipulation recovery, describes this as manipulation immunity, the ability to recognize and resist manipulative tactics before they can destabilize your sense of reality or self-worth. It's not about becoming cynical or closed off, but about developing the psychological sophistication to distinguish between genuine care and calculated manipulation. The aftermath and reflection. In the weeks following that conversation, Lila's passive-aggressive comments stopped entirely. Whether she recognized that her tactics were no longer effective or simply moved on to other targets, I never knew. What mattered was that the psychological warfare that had dominated my social life for months finally ended. The experience had taught me several crucial lessons about the nature of sophisticated manipulation. Passive aggression is active manipulation disguised as concern. Unlike genuine passive-aggressive behavior, which involves resistance through noncompliance, covert aggression is a calculated strategy to undermine targets while maintaining plausible deniability. Backhanded compliments are precision weapons designed to create confusion and self-doubt. They exploit our natural desire for positive feedback, while simultaneously undermining our confidence and social standing. Public manipulation is often more damaging than private manipulation. When manipulative tactics are deployed in social settings, they can shape how entire networks of people perceive conflicts and relationships. Recovery requires developing the ability to recognize manipulation in real time. This isn't about becoming suspicious of everyone, but about learning to distinguish between genuine care and calculated control. Responding to manipulation requires refusing to engage with the manipulator's framework. You don't need to convince them they're wrong or justify your boundaries. You just need to maintain them consistently. The long-term impact. A year after Lila's passive-aggressive campaign ended, I could see its lasting effects on my psychological development. While the experience had been painful and destabilizing, it had also been educational in ways that ultimately strengthened my emotional intelligence and interpersonal skills. I'd become much better at recognizing subtle forms of manipulation in other relationships. The skills I'd developed to identify and resist Lila's tactics transferred to other situations where people might try to use guilt, confusion, or social pressure to control my behavior. I'd also developed a much clearer sense of my own boundaries and the confidence to maintain them even when doing so was socially uncomfortable. The experience of successfully resisting months of sophisticated manipulation had proven to me that I could trust my own perceptions and stand up for my well-being even when others questioned my choices. Perhaps most importantly, I'd learned to distinguish between healthy relationship dynamics and manipulative ones. The contrast between Lila's calculated friendliness and the genuine care of my actual friends became starkly apparent. Real friends didn't need to undermine my confidence to boost their own status. They didn't need to monitor my mental health or comment on my recovery from fictional crises. They supported my growth without taking credit for it or positioning themselves as essential to my well-being. The wisdom of experience. 2 years later, when I occasionally encountered Lila at social events, I felt neither anxiety nor anger. Her presence had become simply irrelevant to my life. Not because I'd forgotten what happened, but because I'd integrated the lessons from our relationship in ways that made me stronger and more discerning. I could see her attempting similar tactics with other people. The concerned comments about their well-being, the subtle implications about their past struggles, the positioning of herself as the caring observer monitoring their recovery. But now these behaviors were transparent to me, like magic tricks whose secrets had been revealed. The passive-aggressive campaign that had once destabilized my entire social world had ultimately taught me one of the most valuable lessons of my adult life. That sophistication in manipulation requires sophistication in defense, and that developing the psychological tools to recognize and resist manipulation is one of the most important forms of self-care. The second point of contact in my story, the moment when manipulation escalated from overt control tactics to subtle psychological warfare, had initially felt like a devastating setback in my recovery. But it had actually been the training ground where I developed the emotional intelligence and boundary-setting skills that would protect me for the rest of my life. Sometimes the most valuable education comes from the most difficult teachers. Lila had been an excellent teacher in the worst possible way, and I had become an excellent student in spite of myself. The passive aggression that was meant to break down my confidence had instead built it up. The manipulation that was designed to control me had instead liberated me. And the relationship that had once been my greatest source of confusion had become my clearest source of wisdom about the difference between love and control, support and manipulation, genuine friendship and sophisticated emotional abuse. Chapter 8. The Evidence. Building the case against a manipulator requires more than memory and intuition. It requires proof. 18 months into my relationship with Lila, 8 months after I'd finally escaped her influence, I found myself sitting in my living room surrounded by printed emails, screenshot conversations, and a detailed journal that chronicled our entire friendship with the precision of a forensic accountant. I hadn't set out to build an evidence file. The documentation had begun as self-preservation, a desperate attempt to maintain my grip on reality when Lila's gaslighting made me question my own memories and perceptions. But as the evidence accumulated, it became something more powerful. A comprehensive record of psychological manipulation that revealed patterns invisible to the naked eye. The process of gathering and analyzing evidence taught me something crucial about manipulation. It's not just about individual incidents, but about systematic patterns that are designed to be forgotten, minimized, or reframed. The power of documentation lies not in any single piece of evidence, but in the cumulative weight of the whole story. This chapter explores how I learned to document manipulation, what that evidence revealed about the relationship, and how the process of evidence gathering became its own form of healing and validation. The accidental beginning. My documentation began by accident during the love bombing phase, when I was so overwhelmed by Lila's attention and affection that I started saving her sweetest messages as keepsakes. Screenshots of loving texts, saved voicemails where she told me how special I was, photos she'd taken of us together. I was building a shrine to what felt like the most meaningful relationship of my life. But as our dynamic began to shift and I started experiencing confusion and self-doubt, those same screenshots became tools for reality checking. When Lila claimed she'd never said something I distinctly remembered, I could pull up the text conversation to verify my memory. When she insisted our plans had been different from what I recalled, I had photographic evidence of the original arrangements. This transition from romantic keepsakes to evidence gathering is common among people experiencing gaslighting, according to research on psychological abuse. Dr. Robin Stern, who has extensively studied gaslighting, notes that victims often begin documenting interactions as a way to hold on to their sense of reality when that reality is being systematically undermined. The National Domestic Violence Hotline emphasizes the importance of this kind of documentation, particularly when technology is involved. Since gaslighting can make it difficult to feel like you truly remember what happened, it can be helpful to keep proof of the incidents so you can rely more on the evidence. What I discovered was that the act of documenting was as important as the evidence itself. The process forced me to pay attention to patterns I might otherwise have dismissed or forgotten. It provided an external validation system when my internal compass was being systematically disrupted. The systematic approach. As I became more intentional about documentation, I developed what researchers call a comprehensive evidence strategy. This involved multiple types of evidence gathering designed to capture different aspects of the manipulative behavior. Digital evidence. Screenshots of text conversations, saved emails, recorded voicemails, social media posts, and interactions. Each screenshot included metadata showing dates, times, and contact information to establish authenticity. Written documentation. A detailed journal chronicling incidents as they occurred, including dates, times, locations, witnesses present, and my emotional state during and after each interaction. Behavioral patterns. Tracking recurring themes in Lila's behavior. How she responded to boundaries, what triggered her guilt trips, when she was most likely to engage in gaslighting tactics. Third-party validation. Documenting conversations with mutual friends who had witnessed our interactions or who had been contacted by Lila as part of her triangulation campaigns. Physical evidence. Gifts she'd given me with attached notes, printed copies of online interactions, anything tangible that could corroborate the timeline and nature of our relationship. The domestic violence research community emphasizes the importance of this kind of comprehensive documentation. As noted in medical documentation guidelines for abuse cases, detailed and accurate clinical findings and descriptions of any injuries/wounds, along with objective observations of the patient's appearance, behavior, and demeanor, create a robust evidential foundation. While my situation didn't involve physical abuse, the same principles applied to documenting psychological and emotional manipulation. The key was creating an objective record that could withstand scrutiny and provide validation even when my own memory was being questioned. The journal. The centerpiece of my evidence collection was a detailed journal that I began keeping 3 months into my friendship with Lila, initially as a way to process my confusion about our increasingly complicated dynamic. Each entry followed a consistent format: date and time, exact timestamps for when incidents occurred and when I documented them, location, where interactions took place, including whether others were present, objective description, what actually happened, focusing on observable behaviors and exact quotes rather than my interpretations, emotional impact, how the interaction made me feel, both during and after. Pattern recognition. Connections to previous incidents or recurring themes in our relationship. Context. What was happening in both our lives that might have influenced the interaction. A typical entry looked like this. March 15th, 2024, 7:30 p.m. Documented March 15th, 11:45 p.m. Location: my apartment, no witnesses present. Incident: Lila arrived unannounced around 7 p.m. I mentioned I'd been having a good day at work and felt proud of a presentation I'd given. She responded, "That's great, but don't you think you're setting yourself up for disappointment? You know how you get when things don't go perfectly." When I asked what she meant, she said, "You have a pattern of getting really high about successes and then crashing when reality sets in. I'm just trying to protect you from that." Emotional impact, immediate deflation. Went from feeling proud and confident to questioning whether my excitement was naive or inappropriate. Felt like she was being caring, but also felt diminished and criticized. Pattern. This is similar to incidents on February 22nd, when I was excited about a date with Marcus, and March 8th, when I got positive feedback from my boss. She consistently reframes my positive emotions as warning signs of future problems. Context. She'd seemed stressed about her own work situation lately and mentioned feeling unappreciated by her boss earlier this week. This level of detail served multiple purposes. It created an objective record that I could reference when my memory was challenged. It helped me identify patterns that were invisible in the moment, but clear when viewed across time. And it provided emotional validation by acknowledging the impact of Lila's behavior, even when that impact seemed disproportionate to the incident itself. Research on trauma documentation emphasizes the importance of this kind of detailed recording. As noted by the National Domestic Violence Hotline, keeping a record that includes the date and time of each incident, what the abuser did or said, and what actions, if any, you took creates a foundation for both healing and potential legal action. The digital trail. Perhaps the most revealing evidence came from digital communications, texts, emails, and social media interactions that provided an unfiltered view of Lila's manipulation tactics. Text messages were particularly illuminating because they captured real-time emotional manipulation without the filter of hindsight or reinterpretation. I could see exactly how she used language to create guilt, confusion, and dependency. A representative exchange from our text history. Lila, 2:30 p.m. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday and I'm worried I upset you. I know you've been sensitive lately and I'd hate to think I added to your stress. Me, 2:45 p.m. I'm not upset and I don't think I've been particularly sensitive. What made you think that? Lila, 2:47 p.m. Oh honey, you don't see it but you've been on edge for weeks. Marcus mentioned it too when we talked. I think all the pressure at work is really getting to you. Me, 3:15 p.m. Marcus said I seemed on edge? When did you talk to him about me? Lila, 3:18 p.m. I don't want to make you more paranoid than you already are. He was just concerned about you, like I am. We both love you and want to make sure you're taking care of yourself. Me, 3:25 p.m. I'm not paranoid. I just want to know what you two discussed about me. Lila, 3:30 p.m. See, this is exactly what I mean. You're reading hostility into everything. Maybe you should talk to someone about this anxiety you've been having. This single exchange contains multiple manipulation tactics that become clear when documented and analyzed. Gaslighting, telling me I'm sensitive and on edge when I hadn't felt either way. Triangulation, involving Marcus to validate her concerns about my mental state. Deflection, turning my legitimate question about their conversation into evidence of my paranoia. Pathologizing, suggesting I have anxiety that requires professional help. Reality distortion, reframing my normal response to her boundary violation as proof of my instability. When viewed in isolation, this conversation might seem like concern from a caring friend. But when documented as part of a larger pattern, it revealed the systematic nature of her manipulation. Research on digital evidence in abuse cases emphasizes the importance of preserving these kinds of communications. Guidelines recommend printing out emails or call logs that contain evidence or information about the incident, and taking screenshots of text messages or social media posts, while ensuring the documentation includes the sender, recipient, date, and time. I followed these guidelines meticulously, creating digital folders organized by date and type of interaction, with backup copies stored in multiple locations to prevent accidental loss or deliberate deletion. The pattern analysis. The most revealing aspect of my evidence collection wasn't any individual incident. It was the patterns that emerged when I analyzed the data systematically. I created spreadsheets tracking different types of manipulative behavior across time, looking for trends, triggers, and escalation patterns. Gaslighting incidents. I documented 47 distinct instances where Lila directly contradicted my memory of events, denied previous statements, or claimed I had misunderstood clear communications. These incidents clustered around times when I was feeling confident or independent, suggesting they were strategic rather than accidental. Boundary violations. I recorded 23 instances where she violated explicitly stated boundaries, from showing up unannounced after I'd asked for space to sharing personal information I'd asked her to keep confidential. Each violation was followed by justifications about love, concern, or my own inability to see what was best for me. Triangulation events. I tracked 15 occasions where she involved third parties in our conflicts, from asking friends to intervene on her behalf to sharing concerns about my mental health with mutual acquaintances. These events invariably occurred after I'd challenged her behavior or asserted independence. Love bombing cycles. I identified a clear pattern of excessive attention and affection following periods of conflict or distance. These cycles followed a predictable sequence: tension, withdrawal, love bombing, honeymoon period, then gradual return to manipulative behavior. Emotional rescue scenarios. I documented 8 instances where she positioned herself as my savior during crises, including several situations where she appeared to have insider knowledge of my problems before I'd shared them with her. This pattern analysis revealed what researchers call the systematic nature of psychological manipulation. Dr. George Simon, who studies manipulative personalities, notes that manipulators employ tactics not randomly, but strategically, often in predictable patterns designed to maintain psychological control. The data showed that Lila's behavior wasn't the result of poor communication skills or emotional instability. It was a calculated campaign designed to create dependency and maintain control. The evidence revealed intent, which transformed individual incidents from misunderstandings into components of a larger manipulation strategy. The validation process. One of the most powerful aspects of building this evidence file was how it validated experiences I'd been trained to doubt or minimize. The documentation provided external confirmation of my internal reality, counteracting months of gaslighting and self-doubt. When I reviewed the evidence months after our friendship ended, several things became clear. My memories were accurate. In every case where I documented her exact words alongside my memory of events, my recollections were precise. The gaslighting had made me doubt my memory, but the evidence proved my perceptions were reliable. The emotional impact was proportional. Incidents that had left me feeling confused, anxious, or diminished were revealed to be genuinely problematic when viewed objectively. My emotional responses hadn't been oversensitive. They'd been appropriate reactions to manipulative behavior. The patterns were systematic. What had felt like random conflicts or misunderstandings were actually part of a coordinated strategy to undermine my confidence and independence. The escalation was deliberate. The manipulation had intensified gradually, with each boundary violation testing my tolerance for increasingly problematic behavior. This validation process is crucial for recovery from psychological manipulation, according to research on trauma healing. Survivors of emotional abuse often struggle with self-doubt and self-blame long after the abuse has ended. Having concrete evidence of what occurred can be essential for rebuilding trust in one's own perceptions and experiences. The evidence as healing tool. Perhaps the most unexpected aspect of building this evidence file was how therapeutic the process became. The act of documentation served multiple healing functions. Reality anchoring. When gaslighting made me question my memories, the evidence provided an objective anchor I could trust. Pattern recognition. Seeing the systematic nature of the manipulation helped me understand that the problems in our relationship weren't due to my inadequacies or oversensitivity. Empowerment. Having concrete proof of her behavior gave me confidence to maintain boundaries and resist future manipulation attempts. Closure. The evidence helped me understand exactly what had happened in our relationship, providing the closure that comes from having a clear narrative. Future protection. The skills I developed in recognizing and documenting manipulation made me more resistant to similar tactics from other people. Research on documentation as a healing practice shows that journaling about traumatic experiences can help survivors process emotions, identify patterns, and regain a sense of control over their narrative. The evidence file served all these functions while also providing practical protection against ongoing manipulation. The legal and social dimensions. While I never pursued legal action against Lila, building the evidence file taught me about the legal and social standards for proving psychological manipulation. The documentation process revealed why emotional abuse is often difficult to prove and prosecute. It requires sophisticated evidence gathering and pattern analysis that most people aren't trained to provide. Research on legal standards for emotional abuse cases shows that courts typically require clear and convincing evidence of a pattern of behavior designed to control, coerce, or intimidate. This standard reflects the complexity of psychological manipulation and the difficulty of proving intent in non-physical abuse cases. My evidence file would have met these standards. The documented patterns of gaslighting, boundary violations, and systematic undermining of my mental health created a compelling case for psychological manipulation. The detailed journal entries, corroborating digital evidence, and third-party witness accounts provided the kind of comprehensive documentation that legal experts recommend. But perhaps more importantly, the evidence file provided social validation. When mutual friends questioned my decision to end the friendship or suggested I was overreacting, I had concrete examples to share that illustrated the problematic patterns. This was particularly important given Lila's smear campaign and her attempts to portray me as mentally unstable. The technology component. A significant portion of my evidence came from technology-facilitated interactions. Texts, emails, social media posts, and digital communications that provided an unfiltered view of Lila's manipulation tactics. This digital evidence was particularly valuable because it captured real-time emotional manipulation without the filter of memory or reinterpretation. I used several strategies for preserving digital evidence, following guidelines from domestic violence prevention organizations. Screenshot documentation. I took screenshots of text conversations, ensuring each image captured the contact information, date, and timestamps. Multiple screenshots were often necessary to show the full context of exchanges. Email preservation. I printed emails with full header information, which preserved details about sender IP addresses and routing information that could verify authenticity. Social media evidence. I documented social media posts and interactions, including the full URL and profile information to establish the source and timing of posts. Cloud storage. I backed up all digital evidence to secure cloud storage accounts, protecting against accidental deletion or device failure. Chain of custody. I maintained detailed records of when evidence was collected, how it was stored, and who had access to it, following legal standards for evidence preservation. This technological component of evidence gathering became increasingly important as I realized how much of our manipulation had occurred through digital channels. Text messages, in particular, revealed manipulation tactics that were subtle in person but obvious when preserved in writing. The unexpected discoveries. As I analyzed the evidence file months after our friendship ended, several patterns emerged that had been invisible during the relationship itself. Timing patterns. Lila's most manipulative behavior consistently occurred when I was feeling confident, successful, or independent. This wasn't coincidental. It was strategic intervention designed to undermine my self-reliance. Information gathering. Many of her seemingly casual questions were actually intelligence gathering designed to identify vulnerabilities she could later exploit. The evidence showed a clear pattern of probing for insecurities and using that information in future manipulation attempts. Narrative control. She consistently worked to control the story of our relationship, both in real time and in hindsight, reframing conflicts as my mental health issues and positioning herself as the caring friend dealing with my instability. Social manipulation. The evidence revealed extensive behind-the-scenes work to influence mutual friends' perceptions of me and our conflict, including sharing selective information designed to generate sympathy for her and concern about me. Testing boundaries. Each boundary violation was actually a test to see how much manipulation I would tolerate. When I accepted smaller violations, she escalated to larger ones, systematically expanding her control over my life. These discoveries helped me understand that the manipulation had been far more sophisticated and systematic than I'd realized during the relationship. The evidence revealed a level of calculation and intent that was both disturbing and validating, disturbing because it showed the depth of her manipulation, but validating because it proved that my discomfort and confusion had been appropriate responses to genuinely problematic behavior. The broader implications. Building this evidence file taught me several broader lessons about the nature of psychological manipulation and the importance of documentation in relationships. Manipulation is designed to be forgotten. Manipulative behavior often seems less problematic in hindsight than it felt in the moment. Documentation preserves the immediate impact and prevents the minimization that manipulators depend on. Patterns reveal intent. Individual incidents might be explained away as misunderstandings or personality conflicts, but patterns reveal systematic behavior designed to achieve specific outcomes. Digital evidence is crucial. In our technology-mediated world, much manipulation occurs through digital channels that can be preserved and analyzed objectively. Documentation is both protection and healing. The process of building evidence serves both practical and therapeutic functions, providing legal protection while also supporting psychological recovery. External validation is essential. When someone is systematically undermining your perceptions, having objective evidence becomes crucial for maintaining your grip on reality. The final analysis. 2 years after building my evidence file, I can see how crucial this documentation was to my recovery from Lila's manipulation. The evidence provided the foundation for everything that followed: my ability to maintain boundaries, my confidence in confronting her behavior, my resilience against her smear campaign, and ultimately my capacity to heal from the psychological damage she'd inflicted. The file contained over 200 pages of documentation spanning 18 months of friendship. When viewed as a whole, it painted a clear picture of systematic psychological manipulation designed to create dependency and maintain control. Individual incidents that had seemed ambiguous or minor became part of a larger pattern that was undeniably problematic. But perhaps the most valuable aspect of the evidence file wasn't what it revealed about Lila. It was what it taught me about myself. The documentation showed that my perceptions had been accurate, my emotional responses had been appropriate, and my decision to end the friendship had been justified. It provided the objective validation I needed to trust my own judgment and move forward with confidence. The evidence file became more than just proof of manipulation. It became proof of my own strength, resilience, and ability to recognize and resist psychological abuse. It documented not just her campaign to control me, but my gradual awakening to what was happening and my ultimate decision to protect myself. In building the case against her manipulation, I had inadvertently built the case for my own recovery. The evidence that proved her guilt also proved my innocence, not just of the mental instability she claimed I had, but of the self-doubt and confusion she had systematically created. The documentation process had transformed me from a victim of gaslighting into a survivor with the tools and knowledge to protect myself from future manipulation. And that transformation, recorded in meticulous detail across hundreds of pages of evidence, became the most powerful proof of all. Proof that even the most sophisticated psychological manipulation can be recognized, documented, and ultimately overcome. Chapter 9. Recovery and Self-Reconstruction. 10 months after my final confrontation with Lila, I sat in my therapist's office holding a folder thick with evidence, screenshots, journal entries, documented patterns of manipulation that had consumed nearly 2 years of my life. I'd survived the love bombing, the gaslighting, the guilt campaigns, the silent treatment, and the passive-aggressive warfare. I'd documented it all with forensic precision. But now came the hardest part: rebuilding myself from the psychological rubble that remained. Recovery from manipulation isn't just about understanding what happened to you, Dr. Sarah Martinez explained, her voice gentle but firm. It's about reconstructing your relationship with yourself, your ability to trust your own perceptions, make autonomous decisions, and form healthy connections with others. The folder in my lap represented proof that I hadn't imagined the manipulation, that my responses had been rational reactions to genuinely problematic behavior. But having evidence and having healing were two different things entirely. I was about to embark on the most challenging phase of my journey, learning to live as myself again, without the constant influence of someone who had systematically undermined my sense of reality. This chapter explores the long, complex process of recovery from psychological manipulation. Not just the dramatic moments of escape and confrontation, but the quiet daily work of rebuilding trust in yourself and learning to navigate relationships without hypervigilance, people-pleasing, or the desperate need for external validation that manipulation tactics create. The landscape of damage. Before I could rebuild, I had to understand exactly what needed reconstruction. Dr. Martinez helped me map the specific ways that 18 months of psychological manipulation had altered my cognitive, emotional, and social functioning. Trust in my own perceptions. The gaslighting had been so systematic that I'd learned to doubt my memory, my emotional responses, and my ability to accurately assess situations. I found myself constantly seeking external validation for experiences that should have been self-evident. Decision-making capacity. After months of having my choices questioned, undermined, or overruled, I'd lost confidence in my ability to make good decisions. I second-guessed everything from major life choices to what to order for lunch. Emotional regulation. The trauma bonding had created an addiction to external validation that left me feeling empty and anxious when I wasn't receiving positive feedback from others. I'd learned to regulate my emotions through other people's approval rather than through my own internal resources. Social trust. The triangulation and smear campaigns had made me hypervigilant about other people's motives and suspicious of new friendships. I was constantly scanning for signs of manipulation or insincerity. Boundaries. I'd learned to prioritize other people's comfort over my own well-being, to say yes when I meant no, and to accept treatment that violated my values rather than risk conflict or abandonment. Self-worth. Perhaps most damaging was how the manipulation had eroded my sense of inherent value. I'd internalized the message that I was difficult, oversensitive, mentally unstable, and fundamentally flawed. Research on recovery from psychological manipulation shows that these impacts are common and predictable. Dr. Judith Herman, who pioneered trauma treatment, describes recovery as occurring in 3 stages: establishing safety, reconstructing the trauma narrative, and reconnecting with community. But unlike single-incident trauma, manipulation trauma requires additional work to rebuild the basic cognitive and emotional skills that were systematically undermined. Stage 1. Establishing internal safety. The first phase of recovery focused on what Dr. Martinez called internal safety, creating conditions where I could begin to trust my own thoughts and feelings again. Recognizing manipulation in real time. I practiced identifying manipulation tactics as they occurred in daily life, not just in retrospect. This involved learning to notice when I felt confused, anxious, or diminished after interactions, and asking myself whether the other person might be using guilt, pressure, or gaslighting tactics. Emotional validation. I learned to validate my own emotional responses instead of immediately questioning whether they were appropriate. If I felt uncomfortable, hurt, or angry, those feelings were valid data about my experience, regardless of whether others agreed. Reality testing. I developed strategies for checking my perceptions against objective evidence rather than relying on others to tell me what was real. This included journaling about events immediately after they occurred, taking photos or screenshots when possible, and trusting documented facts over emotional appeals. Stress reduction. The chronic hypervigilance required to navigate a manipulative relationship had left my nervous system in a constant state of activation. I learned techniques for calming my fight-or-flight response through meditation, deep breathing, regular exercise, and ensuring adequate sleep. The goal wasn't to become suspicious of everyone, but to rebuild my ability to distinguish between safe and unsafe people, appropriate and inappropriate behavior, normal social interaction, and calculated manipulation. One of the most powerful exercises Dr. Martinez gave me was called the Reality Check Journal. Every day, I wrote down 3 observations about my experience that I could verify independently. What time I woke up, what I ate for breakfast, how I felt during specific activities. It sounds simple, but after months of having my perceptions questioned, this basic practice of trusting my own experience felt revolutionary. Stage 2. Rebuilding self-trust. The second phase of recovery focused on reconstructing my ability to trust my own judgment and make autonomous decisions. Starting small, I began with low-stakes decisions where the consequences of being wrong were minimal. What movie to watch, which route to take to work, whether to accept a social invitation. Each small decision that led to a positive or neutral outcome built evidence that I could trust my judgment. Honoring my preferences. During the manipulation, I'd learned to suppress or minimize my own preferences in favor of whatever would maintain harmony with Lila. I practiced identifying what I actually wanted in various situations, regardless of what others might prefer. Setting micro-boundaries. I started with tiny boundaries that felt manageable, leaving conversations that made me uncomfortable, declining invitations I wasn't interested in, expressing disagreement with minor opinions. Each successful boundary reinforced my right to have preferences and limitations. Celebrating small wins. I learned to acknowledge and celebrate moments when I trusted my instincts successfully. If I had a feeling about someone and later events confirmed my intuition, I made note of it. If I made a decision that turned out well, I gave myself credit rather than attributing it to luck. Processing mistakes with compassion. Perhaps most importantly, I learned to handle mistakes without interpreting them as evidence of my fundamental inadequacy. When I made poor choices, I practiced self-compassion while extracting lessons for future decisions. Dr. Martinez explained that self-trust isn't about never making mistakes. It's about trusting your ability to handle whatever consequences arise from your choices. The manipulation had taught me that any mistake was catastrophic and required external rescue. Recovery meant learning that I could survive and learn from poor decisions without losing my worth as a person. Stage 3. Healing trauma bonds. One of the most challenging aspects of recovery was addressing the trauma bonding that had made my relationship with Lila feel like the most meaningful connection of my life, even as it was systematically damaging my mental health. Trauma bonds create a psychological addiction to the person who alternates between providing comfort and causing distress. Even months after ending the relationship, I found myself craving Lila's approval, missing the intensity of our connection, and romanticizing the good times, while minimizing the manipulation. Understanding the biochemistry. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that trauma bonding involves actual changes in brain chemistry. The intermittent reinforcement of love bombing, followed by withdrawal, creates dopamine patterns similar to those found in gambling addiction. My brain had literally become addicted to the cycle of anxiety and relief that characterized our relationship. Identifying triggers. I learned to recognize situations, emotions, or circumstances that triggered cravings for Lila's validation. Stress, loneliness, uncertainty, and even positive achievements could trigger thoughts of reaching out to her or fantasies about reconciliation. Developing alternative coping strategies. Instead of seeking validation from potentially manipulative sources, I developed healthier ways to meet my needs for connection, comfort, and reassurance. This included calling supportive friends, engaging in self-care activities, and learning to self-soothe during difficult emotions. Grieving the fantasy. Perhaps the most painful part of trauma bond recovery was grieving the relationship I'd thought I had with Lila. The deep connection, the mutual understanding, the sense of being uniquely valued. Learning to separate the fantasy from the reality was an ongoing process that involved genuine mourning. The trauma bond recovery process was complicated by the fact that some aspects of our relationship had been genuinely positive. The conversations, shared experiences, and moments of connection were real, even if they were embedded in a manipulative dynamic. I had to learn to hold both truths simultaneously, that some of what I'd experienced had been meaningful, and that the overall relationship had been harmful to my well-being. Stage 4. Developing healthy relationship skills. The manipulation had not only damaged my relationship with myself, it had also distorted my understanding of what healthy relationships looked like. I needed to relearn basic relationship skills that I'd never properly developed or that had been corrupted during the manipulation. Recognizing red flags. I studied the early warning signs of manipulative behavior so I could identify problematic patterns before becoming emotionally invested. This included love bombing, boundary testing, information gathering, and attempts to isolate me from other relationships. Communicating needs directly. The manipulation had taught me to communicate through hints, emotional manipulation, and passive aggression. I practiced stating my needs, preferences, and boundaries clearly and directly, without apologizing for having them. Tolerating conflict. One reason I'd been vulnerable to manipulation was my terror of conflict and abandonment. I learned that healthy relationships involve disagreement, that conflict can be productive, and that someone who truly cares about me won't abandon me for expressing different opinions. Giving and receiving support. The trauma bonding had created unhealthy patterns of caretaking, where I took responsibility for other people's emotions while neglecting my own needs. I learned to offer support without losing myself, and to accept help without feeling obligated to reciprocate immediately, maintaining individual identity. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that healthy relationships enhance rather than subsume individual identity. I practiced maintaining my own interests, friendships, and goals even when forming new close connections. This process was complicated by my hypervigilance around manipulation. In early recovery, I sometimes interpreted normal relationship friction as red flags, or misread healthy boundaries as rejection. Learning to distinguish between appropriate caution and trauma-based overreaction was an ongoing challenge. Stage 5. Reconstructing my support network. The manipulation had systematically damaged my relationships with friends and family members. Some relationships had been severed through Lila's triangulation campaigns. Others had been neglected during the intense period of our friendship, and still others had been contaminated by my own trauma responses. Making amends. I reached out to friends I'd neglected or treated poorly during the manipulation period. This involved taking responsibility for my behavior without over-explaining or seeking excessive reassurance. Gradual re-engagement. I slowly rebuilt connections with people who had remained supportive throughout my ordeal. This required vulnerability about what I'd experienced and patience with my ongoing recovery process. Building new relationships. I gradually formed new friendships with people who had no connection to the manipulation drama. These relationships provided opportunities to practice healthy interaction patterns without the baggage of past conflicts. Maintaining appropriate boundaries. I learned to share my recovery story selectively, with people who had earned my trust through consistent supportive behavior. Not everyone needed to know the details of what I'd experienced. Accepting limited relationships. Some friendships had been permanently damaged by the manipulation period. I learned to accept that not all relationships could or should be repaired, and that this was a natural consequence of the choices I'd made during a difficult time. The process of rebuilding my social network was slower than I'd expected. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild, both in others and in myself. I had to learn to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing whether new people were genuinely trustworthy while also remaining open to authentic connection. The daily practice of recovery. Recovery from manipulation isn't a linear process with a clear endpoint. It's an ongoing practice of choosing mental health and authentic relationships over familiar patterns of dysfunction. Even 2 years after ending my relationship with Lila, I still had to actively maintain the skills and perspectives I'd developed in therapy. Morning intention setting. I started each day by checking in with myself about my emotional state, my priorities for the day, and my commitment to honoring my own needs and boundaries. Regular reality checks. Throughout the day, I paused to notice my thoughts and feelings, validating my experiences without immediately seeking external confirmation. Evening reflection. Before bed, I reflected on the day's interactions, celebrating moments when I'd trusted my instincts or maintained healthy boundaries, and noting areas for continued growth. Ongoing education. I continued reading about manipulation tactics, healthy relationships, and trauma recovery. Knowledge remained my best protection against future victimization. Therapeutic maintenance. I maintained regular contact with Dr. Martinez, not because I was in crisis, but because ongoing professional support helped me maintain my progress and continue growing. The goal wasn't to become perfect or invulnerable, but to develop sufficient self-awareness and self-trust to navigate relationships authentically while protecting my well-being. Unexpected gifts of recovery. While I wouldn't wish the experience of manipulation on anyone, the recovery process did provide some unexpected benefits that enhanced my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. Enhanced empathy. Having experienced manipulation myself made me more sensitive to signs that others might be struggling with similar dynamics. I was able to offer support to friends in difficult relationships without judgment or pressure. Improved intuition. The process of rebuilding trust in my own perceptions actually made me more intuitive about people and situations. I learned to pay attention to subtle cues that I'd previously ignored or dismissed. Stronger boundaries. The necessity of protecting myself during recovery helped me develop much clearer boundaries in all my relationships. I became better at saying no, expressing preferences, and maintaining my individual identity. Deeper self-knowledge. The intensive self-examination required for recovery gave me a much clearer understanding of my values, needs, preferences, and goals. I knew myself better at 30 than I ever had before. Appreciation for authentic relationships. Having experienced the exhaustion and confusion of a manipulative relationship made me deeply grateful for genuine connections characterized by mutual respect, support, and authenticity. These gifts didn't justify or minimize the harm I'd experienced, but they did give meaning to my suffering and motivation for continued growth. Warning signs of incomplete recovery. Dr. Martinez also helped me recognize signs that my recovery might be stalling or moving in unhealthy directions. Isolation. If I found myself withdrawing from all close relationships to avoid potential manipulation, that was overcorrection rather than healing. Hypervigilance. If I was constantly scanning for signs of manipulation in normal social interactions, I was still operating from a trauma response rather than from centered awareness. People-pleasing. If I was still prioritizing others' comfort over my own well-being, I hadn't fully internalized my right to have needs and boundaries. External validation seeking. If I was still constantly seeking reassurance about my perceptions or decisions, I hadn't rebuilt sufficient self-trust. Rumination. If I was still frequently rehashing the manipulation or obsessing about Lila's behavior, I was giving her continued power over my mental and emotional state. These warning signs helped me recognize when I needed additional support or when I was falling back into familiar but unhealthy patterns. The ongoing journey. 3 years after my relationship with Lila ended, I can honestly say that I'm not just recovered. I'm healthier than I was before I met her. The manipulation forced me to develop psychological skills and self-awareness that I might never have cultivated otherwise. I'm in a romantic relationship with someone who consistently demonstrates respect for my autonomy, supports my individual growth, and resolves conflicts through direct communication rather than manipulation. I have friendships characterized by mutual support, authentic connection, and healthy boundaries. I have work that I find meaningful and a sense of purpose that comes from my own values rather than external approval. But recovery isn't a destination, it's an ongoing practice. I still occasionally catch myself seeking external validation for things I should trust my own judgment about. I still sometimes struggle with conflict avoidance or people-pleasing tendencies. The difference is that now I recognize these patterns quickly and have tools to address them before they become problematic. The manipulation that once felt like it might destroy me ultimately taught me that I'm more resilient, more perceptive, and more capable of self-protection than I'd ever imagined. The evidence folder that documented Lila's manipulation also documented my gradual awakening to what was happening and my ultimate decision to choose my own well-being over a toxic connection. Recovery from psychological manipulation is possible, but it requires patience, professional support, and a commitment to doing the daily work of rebuilding trust in yourself. The journey is difficult, but the destination, a life lived authentically from your own center rather than in reaction to others' manipulation, is worth every challenging step along the way. The woman who sat in Dr. Martinez's office that first day, clutching evidence of manipulation and unsure whether she could trust her own perceptions, had evolved into someone who could recognize unhealthy dynamics immediately, maintain appropriate boundaries consistently, and form genuine connections based on mutual respect rather than trauma bonding or dependency. That transformation didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen without setbacks and struggles. But it did happen. And if it happened for me, it can happen for anyone willing to do the work of reclaiming themselves from the psychological wreckage of manipulation. The most important lesson I learned in recovery was this. The person who tried to convince me I couldn't trust myself was wrong. I could trust myself. I just had to learn how to do it again. Chapter 10. The Final Confrontation. The confrontation I'd been avoiding came exactly 2 years and 3 months after I'd first met Lila, 18 months after I'd finally escaped her manipulation, and 6 months after I thought our story was over. It arrived disguised as an invitation to my friend Emma's wedding, an elegant card tucked inside an envelope that also contained a handwritten note from Emma herself. I know things have been complicated between you and Lila, but she's one of my oldest friends, and you've become so important to me too. I really hope you'll both be there. Maybe this could be a chance for healing. I stared at the note for 20 minutes, my carefully constructed piece suddenly feeling fragile. I'd spent months rebuilding myself, developing the psychological tools to recognize and resist manipulation, creating a life that felt authentic and secure. But the prospect of seeing Lila again, in a social setting where I couldn't simply walk away, surrounded by mutual friends who expected civility, triggered every anxiety response I'd worked so hard to overcome. This was the test I'd been dreading and secretly knowing would come. The moment when all my recovery work would be put to the ultimate trial. Not in the safety of my therapist's office or through careful reflection in my journal, but in real-time confrontation with the person who had systematically dismantled my sense of reality and self-worth. This chapter explores that final encounter. Not just the event itself, but the preparation, the experience, and the profound shift in understanding that came from facing my manipulator one last time with full awareness of her tactics and complete commitment to my own well-being. The preparation. Dr. Martinez and I spent 3 sessions preparing for the wedding. Not because I was falling apart at the prospect of seeing Lila again, but because we both understood that this encounter would be fundamentally different from all previous interactions. This time, I would be attending as someone who fully understood manipulation tactics, who had documented evidence of abusive behavior, and who had developed the psychological skills to protect myself. The goal isn't to confront her or prove anything, Dr. Martinez explained. The goal is to attend your friend's wedding, enjoy the celebration, and demonstrate to yourself that you can be in the same space as someone who once controlled you without losing your center. We developed what she called a protection protocol, a comprehensive strategy for managing the encounter while maintaining my psychological safety. Pre-event preparation. I would arrive early and position myself strategically, ensuring I had clear exits and access to supportive friends. I'd limit alcohol consumption to maintain full cognitive clarity. I'd bring my phone with access to my support network and evidence documentation if needed. Interaction guidelines. I would be polite but not warm, civil but not engaging. I would avoid being alone with Lila at any point. If she attempted manipulation tactics, I would use predetermined responses and extract myself from the situation. Reality anchoring. I would check in with trusted friends throughout the event, using them as external validation for my perceptions and experiences. I'd document any significant interactions immediately after they occurred. Emergency protocols. I had a code word arranged with my sister who would be attending, a backup plan for leaving early if necessary, and Dr. Martinez's number programmed for immediate access if I needed professional support. The preparation felt both excessive and essential. Excessive because it was just a wedding, just a few hours in the same space as someone I'd once been friends with. Essential because I understood that Lila's manipulation had been so sophisticated and my trauma bonding so complete that even with all my recovery work, I remained potentially vulnerable to her influence. Research on confronting manipulators emphasizes the importance of this kind of preparation. Dr. George Simon, who has extensively studied manipulative personalities, notes that manipulators are most dangerous when they have time to prepare their strategies and when their targets are caught off guard. The key to successful confrontation is never to be caught off guard. The arrival. Emma's wedding was everything she'd dreamed of. An outdoor ceremony in a botanical garden, followed by a reception in an elegant pavilion surrounded by flowering trees. I arrived 45 minutes early, as planned, and spent time connecting with friends who had no history with the Lila drama. I positioned myself at a table with strong allies and made sure I knew where every exit was located. When Lila arrived, I felt the familiar physiological response: increased heart rate, shallow breathing, hypervigilance. But this time, instead of being surprised or overwhelmed by these reactions, I recognized them as normal trauma responses and used the grounding techniques I'd practiced in therapy. She looked exactly as I remembered, but somehow smaller. Not physically, she was still tall, still commanding presence, but her psychological impact on me had diminished dramatically. The person who had once seemed larger than life, whose approval had felt essential to my survival, now looked like exactly what she was: another human being with her own insecurities and problems. This shift in perception is common among people who have successfully recovered from manipulative relationships. Dr. Meredith Thompson, who specializes in gaslighting recovery, explains that when you've rebuilt trust in yourself and developed emotional independence, former manipulators often appear much less powerful and intimidating than they once did. Lila spotted me within minutes of arriving. Our eyes met across the reception space, and I saw her expression shift through several emotions: surprise, calculation, something that might have been vulnerability. Then she smiled, the same warm, engaging smile that had once made me feel special and chosen, and began walking toward me. This was it. The moment I'd been preparing for, dreading, and in some strange way, anticipating for months. The encounter. "Tessa," she said, arriving at my table with that familiar tone of warm familiarity, as if we were old friends who'd simply lost touch rather than former intimates who'd ended things in conflict and mutual recrimination. "You look wonderful. I've missed seeing you." The words were perfectly chosen. Friendly but not presumptuous, complimentary but not excessive, nostalgic but not manipulative. To anyone observing, she would have appeared gracious and genuinely pleased to see me. But I could see the calculation behind her eyes, the careful assessment of my reaction, the strategic positioning of her approach. "Hello, Lila," I replied, my voice calm and neutral. "I hope you're doing well." It was a nothing response. Polite, appropriate, completely non-committal. I didn't return her compliment, didn't express reciprocal pleasure at seeing her, didn't invite further conversation. I simply acknowledged her presence and deflected the conversational ball back to her court. I watched her process this response, saw the micro-expression of frustration that flashed across her face before settling back into warm friendliness. She'd expected either enthusiastic reconciliation or obvious discomfort. My calm indifference wasn't fitting her script. "May I sit for a moment?" she asked, gesturing to an empty chair at my table. This was the first test. In the past, I would have immediately said yes, prioritizing her comfort over my own boundaries. Now I glanced around the table at my friends, all of whom were watching this interaction with protective interest, and made a different choice. "Actually, we were just about to take a group photo," I said, which was true. My friend Marcus had been trying to coordinate pictures for the past 10 minutes. "Maybe we can catch up later." Her smile remained perfectly in place, but I saw the flash of anger in her eyes. She was being politely dismissed, and she knew it. More importantly, she knew that I knew exactly what I was doing. "Of course," she said graciously. "I'll find you later, so we can have a proper conversation." It was phrased as a pleasantry, but I heard the underlying message. This wasn't over. She would try again, with different tactics, when she'd had time to assess my defenses and plan her approach. But I was ready for that too. The pattern recognition. Over the course of the wedding reception, Lila made 4 more attempts to engage me in conversation. Each attempt revealed a different manipulation strategy, and each one confirmed that despite the passage of time and my obvious recovery, she was still operating from the same playbook that had once been so effective. Attempt 2, the emotional appeal. An hour later, she approached me at the bar, timing her arrival for when I was momentarily alone. "Tessa, I've been doing a lot of thinking about our friendship and the way things ended between us. I know I made mistakes, and I'd really like the chance to apologize properly." This was a sophisticated approach, acknowledging fault without specifying what she'd done wrong, expressing remorse without taking real responsibility, and positioning herself as someone who'd grown and changed. The old me would have been immediately drawn in by the promise of the apology I'd once desperately wanted. "I appreciate that," I replied, accepting my drink from the bartender and turning to leave. "I hope you find peace with however things unfolded." I walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing at the bar with her apology undelivered and her manipulation attempt incomplete. Attempt 3, the mutual friend strategy. During dinner, she enlisted our mutual friend Sarah to act as an intermediary. Sarah approached me during the meal, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Lila asked me to tell you that she'd really like to talk," Sarah said quietly. "She said you two had some kind of misunderstanding, and she'd like to clear the air. She's worried that the tension between you is making things awkward for everyone." This was triangulation in its purest form, using a third party to apply pressure while avoiding direct confrontation. The implication was that I was the one creating social discomfort by maintaining boundaries, and that resolving things was my responsibility. "I'm not feeling any tension," I replied truthfully. "I'm having a wonderful time celebrating Emma's wedding. If Lila is feeling uncomfortable, that's something she'll need to work through on her own." Sarah looked confused, clearly expecting me to either agree to the conversation or become defensive about causing problems. My calm refusal to engage with the drama didn't fit her expectations. Attempt 4. The concerned friend approach. Later in the evening, Lila cornered me in the bathroom, where I couldn't easily escape without causing a scene. This was strategic positioning at its finest, a private space where she could speak freely without witnesses. "I'm worried about you," she said, her voice soft with apparent concern. "I know you went through a difficult time after our friendship ended, and I hope you've been getting the help you need. I heard you were seeing a therapist, which is wonderful. I just want you to know that I don't hold any of that against you." This was perhaps the most sophisticated manipulation attempt of the evening. She was simultaneously expressing concern for my well-being, referencing my therapy in a way that suggested mental instability, positioning herself as magnanimous and forgiving, and implying that my version of our conflict had been the result of psychological problems rather than legitimate grievances. 2 years earlier, this approach would have devastated me. The suggestion that my perceptions had been symptoms rather than accurate assessments would have triggered massive self-doubt and guilt. The implication that she was being generous by not holding my mental health issues against me would have made me feel simultaneously grateful and ashamed. Now, I recognized it as gaslighting of the highest order. "I'm doing very well, thank you," I said, moving toward the bathroom door. "I hope you are too." She stepped slightly in my path, not blocking me entirely, but making it clear she wasn't finished. I think there might have been some misunderstandings between us that got blown out of proportion. Maybe we could. "Excuse me," I said firmly, stepping around her and leaving the bathroom. I'd terminated the conversation before she could complete her manipulation attempt, refusing to engage with her rewriting of our history or her attempts to position my boundaries as symptoms of mental illness. The final strategy. Lila's fifth and final attempt came during the last dance of the evening, when the reception was winding down and people were beginning to say their goodbyes. She approached me one last time, but this strategy was different from all the others. Instead of trying to manipulate me directly, she targeted my support system. I was standing with Marcus and my sister, laughing about something ridiculous that had happened during the ceremony, when Lila approached our group with a warm smile. "I just wanted to say goodbye to everyone," she said pleasantly. "Marcus, it was so good to see you again. And you must be Tessa's sister. I've heard so much about you. I'm Lila." She introduced herself to my sister with genuine warmth, asked thoughtful questions about her flight from across the country, complimented her dress, and generally charmed her way into what appeared to be a delightful conversation. To my sister, who knew nothing about our history beyond the fact that we'd had a falling out, Lila seemed gracious, intelligent, and perfectly lovely. This was perhaps the most sophisticated manipulation of all. Not trying to win me back directly, but demonstrating to my support system how reasonable and likable she was. The implicit message was clear. If I continued to maintain boundaries with someone so obviously wonderful, the problem must be with me. I watched the interaction with fascination rather than anxiety. I could see exactly what she was doing and why it was effective, but I felt no urge to defend myself or explain our history to my sister. Her opinion of Lila, based on a 5-minute conversation, had no bearing on the reality of what I'd experienced or the validity of my decisions. When Lila finally said goodbye and walked away, my sister turned to me with a puzzled expression. "She seems really nice," she said. "What exactly happened between you two?" "We had different ideas about what friendship should look like," I replied. "Sometimes that happens." It was a complete non-answer, but it was all the answer I owed anyone. My sister, who knew me well enough to trust my judgment even when she didn't understand my choices, simply nodded and dropped the subject. The revelation. As I watched Lila work the room during her final goodbyes, charming other friends, complimenting the bride, looking like the picture of grace and social sophistication, I had a profound realization that would have been impossible during our friendship or even in the early stages of my recovery. She wasn't evil. She wasn't a monster. She wasn't even consciously malicious most of the time. She was someone with profound insecurities and attachment issues who had learned to manage her anxiety about relationships through control and manipulation. The love bombing, gaslighting, triangulation, and emotional abuse weren't expressions of malice. They were desperate attempts to ensure that people wouldn't abandon her by making sure they couldn't. This understanding didn't excuse her behavior or minimize the harm she'd caused. Manipulation is still manipulation regardless of the underlying psychological motivations. But it did complete my healing in a way I hadn't expected. For months, I'd held on to anger about what she'd done to me. Even after I'd escaped her influence and rebuilt my life, part of me had remained focused on her wrongdoing, her deliberate cruelty, her calculated manipulation. That anger had been useful during recovery. It had motivated me to maintain boundaries and resist her various attempts to regain control. But seeing her clearly for the first time, not as the larger-than-life figure who had once controlled my reality, not as the monster I'd needed her to be to justify my escape, but as a deeply insecure person with maladaptive coping strategies, allowed me to finally let go of the last remnants of emotional investment in our relationship. Research on forgiveness after manipulation shows that this kind of understanding often marks the final stage of recovery. Dr. Laura Connell, who specializes in toxic relationship recovery, explains that true healing occurs when you can see your former manipulator clearly without needing them to be either savior or villain. I didn't forgive Lila because she deserved forgiveness. I forgave her because I deserved peace. The aftermath. The drive home from the wedding was remarkably peaceful. I'd faced my worst fear, encountering my former manipulator in a social setting, and not only survived but thrived. I'd maintained my boundaries, resisted multiple manipulation attempts, and demonstrated to myself that my recovery was solid and my psychological independence complete. But perhaps most importantly, I'd proven that I could coexist in the same social space as someone who had once controlled me without losing my center or my sense of self. This was crucial because Lila and I moved in overlapping social circles, and complete avoidance wasn't always practical or necessary. That evening, I wrote in my journal, "I saw Lila tonight for the first time in 18 months. She tried 5 different manipulation strategies, exactly as I expected she would. What I didn't expect was how little power any of them would have over me. She seemed smaller somehow, not physically but psychologically, like a magic trick whose secret has been revealed. I feel sorry for her in a way I never have before, but that doesn't make me want to help or rescue her. That's not my job anymore. My job is to continue building the life I want, with people who know how to love without controlling." The broader implications. The wedding encounter taught me several crucial lessons about recovery from manipulation that I couldn't have learned any other way. Manipulation tactics don't change. Lila used exactly the same strategies that had been effective during our friendship: emotional appeals, triangulation, gaslighting, charm campaigns. Manipulators tend to stick with what has worked for them in the past, even when circumstances have changed. Recovery creates immunity. My ability to recognize and resist her tactics in real time demonstrated that the psychological skills I developed in therapy had become automatic responses rather than conscious efforts. Boundaries are for your protection, not their punishment. I maintained clear boundaries not because Lila was evil or because I needed to punish her, but because those boundaries protected my well-being and peace of mind. You don't owe anyone a relationship, despite social pressure to work things out or clear the air. I had no obligation to engage with someone whose presence in my life had been harmful, regardless of their current intentions or apparent growth. Understanding doesn't require reconciliation. Being able to see Lila clearly and even feel compassion for her psychological struggles didn't mean I needed to resume a relationship with her or give her access to my life. Recovery is complete when you stop needing them to be different. I no longer needed Lila to acknowledge her manipulation, apologize for her behavior, or validate my experience. My healing was independent of her actions or attitudes. The final word. 6 months after the wedding, I received one last communication from Lila, a carefully crafted email that arrived on my birthday. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, disguised as personal growth. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately and wanted to reach out on your special day. I know our friendship ended in a way that was painful for both of us, and I've spent a lot of time in therapy working on my own issues and patterns in relationships. I've come to understand that I have a tendency to be controlling when I'm afraid of losing people I care about, and I know that hurt you. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I see now how my behavior affected you, and I'm genuinely sorry. I hope you're finding all the happiness and peace you deserve. Happy birthday." It was everything I'd once desperately wanted to hear. Acknowledgement, apology, evidence of growth and self-awareness. 2 years earlier, this email would have broken my resolve completely. I would have responded immediately, probably suggesting we meet for coffee to talk through everything. Instead, I read it twice, recognized it as one final manipulation attempt. Note the timing on my birthday, the perfect balance of responsibility and victimhood, the opening for me to respond with forgiveness and reconciliation, and deleted it without reply. The silence that followed felt like the closing of a door that had been ajar for years. There was no anger, no triumph, no sadness, just a quiet sense of completion. I'd successfully confronted my manipulator one final time and emerged with my boundaries intact, my psychological independence complete, and my commitment to my own well-being unwavering. The person who had once had the power to shape my reality with her words had sent her best manipulation effort, and it had simply bounced off the psychological armor I'd built through recovery. The final confrontation wasn't the dramatic showdown I'd once imagined. No raised voices, no accusations, no satisfying moment of vindication. It was something much better. A quiet demonstration of complete psychological freedom from someone who had once controlled every aspect of my emotional life. I was finally completely, irreversibly free. The story of my manipulation and recovery was over. The story of the life I'd built in the aftermath, authentic, boundaried, and fully my own, could finally begin.